Hey, what's going on, everybody? Wishing you all had a great and wonderful weekend, because I certainly did. Need a little bit of a break after a harsh work week to sort of just kick back, relax, and have a couple brewskis with the boys. But, there's some unfinished business that I never really got back to revisiting. If you all recall, for anybody that's been watching my channel for more than 5 minutes, I made a video touching up on the Don't Hug Cacti / Lucky Coyote controversy, and if you all remember, that sort of sprang up last month, going into this month. But my sort of introduction to the whole thing had actually happened on basically when Cutins made a plea to the furry fandom, basically asking for monetary and financial support. And that was the first time that I was really exposed in full to like the whole scope of everything that happened, because it was from there I sort of had a chance to look back into what people were referring to. Apparently back in September, 2020, last year, Cutins had been disseminating a document online. It was a Google document, basically encapsulating all of these testimonies or testimonials of accounts from various people throughout the furry fandom that claim to have had so close associations with Lucky Coyote. Lucky Coyote, if you don't recall, is actually, their name is Blonde Foxy these days, but back in the day when I knew of them, I think I never spent more than maybe a couple minutes around her at in passing fancy at conventions, but when I was younger, she was like a premier fursuit maker. Her fursuits were absolutely gorgeous and easy on the eyes, and they were the envy of so many furries throughout the furry fandom. Honestly, her first fursuit, Lucky Coyote, her persona, looked like a Pikachu, kind of, with red streaks on the cheeks. It was a very yellow presentation of fur patterns, but, it was very unique in its own way. It looked very lovable and adorable, and something that you can just cuddle to bed with you. But, yeah. So apparently Lucky Coyote had a close association with various people over the years, and this is all detailed in painstaking detail in personalized accounts, in this Google document. And the Google document had been making its rounds throughout Twitter and various other realms of social media, and it was, basically parsed over by the furry community. The furry community, being what it is, reacted adversely, but not so adversely that there would be cause for concern. This would happen later. Because, if you all recall, the whole reason that Cutins made a plea for financial and monetary support is because, she was served a cease and desist notice by the mink firm. Not the mink farm, like mink firm. Mink is M-I-N-C, for those of you that don't know. But I feel like there's a joke in there somewhere that I'm missing. But, the mink firm is basically like a law firm that specializes in, defamation cases. So, there was the perception by Don't Hug Cacti that the Google document was hurting business. And Don't Hug Cacti, if you don't know, was co-founded by Lucky Coyote and her husband Scuff. So they saw, basically, I see it more as Lucky Coyote is what made Don't Hug Cacti what it is today. A prominent, fairly reputable, or at least was reputable, fursuit making business that, made a lot of gorgeous fursuits. Unfortunately, Lucky Coyote's past actions caught up with her. At least that's the perception that I had in the communications that she had with various people throughout the furry fandom. Her video that she released on the 18th, and, all the testimonials I read over. And make no mistake, I read over them all. I tried not to leave any stone unturned. Of course, the whole Kira the Wolf coming back thing sort of sidetracked me for a bit, so my memory might be a little bit fuzzy, as my refocus was on him. Now it's diverted back to Lucky Coyote. I'm just trying to provide you all an overview of everything that I'm aware of prior to us getting into, the nitty-gritty, finer details, because there's a lot to go over. But we're gonna, look into that in a few minutes here. For right now, I just want to give you that brief overview. So, Cutins makes this plea to the furry fandom, basically starts a GoFundMe to cover the legal expenses to fight the the cease and desist order. The cease and desist order is basically to have the Google document taken down because it's defaming the perception of people that they have of Lucky Coyote, now known as Blonde Foxy. I believe the change happened in recent years from Lucky Coyote to Blonde Foxy, but I never really kept up with the actual dates, because I've always known them as Lucky Coyote. But yeah, Don't Hug Cacti was actually facing a lot of backlash, it appears, but the true fire and furor throughout the furry fandom did not occur until after the defamation, sort of case and, the cease and desist order came. And the perception that many people had in response to this was that Lucky Coyote was essentially trying to silence her victims. Now, Lucky Coyote would make a response video basically on the 18th, basically saying, hey, listen, this is my side of the story, and this is actually what's going on. The problem with that is that my perception of that whole thing is that it appears that, I think that was February 18th, if I recall, 2/18/2021. Ever since the whole Cure the Wolf thing came out, that was my renewed focus, so please forgive me on the dates if I'm getting anything out of order, but I think it was the 4th that I saw the Cutins, making a GoFundMe, and it was the 18th that Lucky Coyote had released that video. In my initial perception from watching that video, it was a fairly lengthy video, and I have to say, props to Lucky Coyote where credit is due. They actually came out to make a response video. Problem is, this was after they already served the cease and desist notice, so I don't know. But let's go ahead and just say that, Lucky Coyote, my perception of her, in that video, is that she was kind of very cold but professional, very on point with the messages she was trying to give, but incredibly vague in its delivery. For instance, she seemed to go into more detail about her business practices, which wasn't the issue here. Went into detail about the business practices of what actually went into the whole people basically trying to discredit people that were trying to bring down her name. She would compare emails that were shared in private versus public reviews on her work, and show that there were glaring discrepancies between people basically thanking her and showing appreciation in private, but besmirching her name in public, as far as her work quality and various other issues that were supposedly resolved already. Anyway, no, I watched the video 3 times in total, and I just wanted to see if I was missing anything. The first half of the video actually does cover her interpersonal relations with a lot of people. She references a few people by name, like Nico and Ruby, but we're gonna get into their associations later. But yeah, the perception, and apparently this wasn't a perception that only I had. A lot of people throughout the furry fandom shared that perception. It's we can give 2 less of a fuck about her business practices in terms of how she sort of mentally and emotionally abused people, and in some cases got a little bit too handsy and close and personal for people's liking, but we're gonna get into that in a few minutes here. Yeah, so that all, she basically tries to give her side of the story, and it was really not until later that YouTubers like Shiokami actually got involved directly. Shiokami actually had a podcast live stream set up for hosting Lucky Coyote and her husband Scuff Coyote onto the show, and she had with her Brony Inspector, who is also a close associate of Shiokami. Shiokami is a pretty, attractive fursuiter, undersuit and oversuit. They have a very nice fursona, and they have very easy on the ears, voice, and easy on the eyes, face. So it's no wonder that a lot of people happen to like her content, and she actually offers a lot of substance in her videos. So that's something for you all to look forward to if you want to check her out sometime. I'll post a link in the description. But yeah. She seemed to have taken on the interest, like I had with the whole Kira the Wolf thing, in trying to get to the truth of the matter. And she offered a much more less biased and more impartial and objective view of everything, I have to say, just to give credit where credit is due. So yeah, the problem with the whole, podcast, she'd made videos up to that point, but it's not really anything different from what I'm delivering to you, other than the fact that she gives Lucky Coyote the benefit of the doubt, which caused a lot of anger throughout the community. But yeah, ever since up to that, podcast where she went into great length, just, I think it was 3 hours long, if I recall, after I watched it, but she basically tries to cover a lot of questions and a lot of details that were perhaps missed in translation ever since, Lucky Coyote had released her video. And what ended up happening was that, Scuff Coyote seemed to take a very direct approach to any questions that were asked. Certain things that were considered problematic or maybe an uncomfortable subject matter, he would step in and seemingly divert the conversation. That's just my perception of things, because Lucky Coyote would speak, but she seemed like she was always overshadowed by Scuff's presence. As in, Scuff would take a very hands-on approach to answering certain questions and diverting the topic, as it were. And ironically, a lot of furries got angry with, like, Shiokami and gave her a lot of backlash. Like, if you watch that live stream video, it's got almost a 50 to 50% ratio of likes to dislikes, which shows that a lot of people were very divided on this subject matter and her handling of things. And there was actually a follow-up, like she made a video live stream following up on her handling of this whole controversy, and she expressed frustration with how people were trying to cancel her. And it's just very unfortunate that somebody was trying to be objective, to try to be very detail-oriented, and to try to be very impartial in how she relayed with somebody that was, potentially innocent, but me personally, I don't think Lucky Coyote is innocent. I don't think she's guilty of everything that's been accused of her, but I don't think she's absolutely innocent. And I'll get into why here in a few minutes. I know I keep putting off certain things, but there's just so much to go over here because, so much has happened. Alright, so TLDR, where is this now? Well, I can tell you one thing. Lucky Coyote hinted at the fact that she doesn't have the money to really pursue a proper cease and desist motion and have force Cutins legally to take down her Google Docs. And on top of which, Cutins has the legal backing of a retainer, payment for a retainer to be able to fight this in court if she has to. And with, I believe Boozy Badger put his 2 cents in on the matter. I might have some screen caps to provide later, but yeah, it's basically stalled out. A lot of people out there and throughout the furry fandom have their own perceptions on this. What I will say is that Lucky Coyote in her video, interestingly enough, her theory is that this was all the big wig fursuit makers out there in the business that were trying to co-opt their efforts with their friends to force Lucky Coyote out of the business, which I have to say is a very interesting but a very far-fetched theory, if ever there was one. Because up to my perception of fursuit makers are that they are up to their eyeballs in commissions, all right? And in spite of the fact that Lucky Coyote might have had her reputation tarnished, she's probably got a lot of business lined up anyway in spite of that, because a lot of people out there, they're going to spend their money. Their money spends wherever they want it to. And her fursuits are damn gorgeous. Now, I will tell you that on social media, like Twitter, there would be several unboxing videos and various other show and tell type videos or clips that basically showcase that they got a Don't Hug Cacti fursuit. Now, the responses from the furry fandoms is that anybody that happened to patronize their business would get attacked. They would get besmirched, they would have their name dragged through the mud, they would have legions of people attacking anybody that had patronized Don't Hug Cacti, aka Lucky Coyote. And it's just sad, because it's kind of how, the situation behind this is completely different, but the similarities are in brand recognition versus business practices. In this case, for Lucky Coyote, it's more how the individual behaved throughout the furry fandom versus the product that they would offer. Think Nike. Nike, everybody wants those Air Jordan pumps. They want that name recognition, they want that brand recognition. But those shoes are made in sweatshops in China and Vietnam. And if you knew how deplorable the conditions in those sweatshops were, there would be, you'd probably second think actually buying a pair of Air Jordans, all right? So it's kind of how, in relation to Don't Hug Cacti fursuits, the connotations are, oh my god, this is such a gorgeous fursuit, but it was made by somebody that's a manipulative and emotionally abusive asshole. That's the basic synopsis here. And also, all the victims that would come out and had basically, offered their personal testimonies, to the fandom, and the fandom read those. There were allegations of zoophilic intent, there were allegations of sexual assault, there were allegations of emotional abuse and, emotional neglect, and, various other little things. Also abuse to animals, abuse and neglect to animals in Lucky Coyote's care. Yeah, there was a lot here. It was a three-ring circus. As to whether or not the evidence is Credible, we'll get into that in a few minutes here, but like enough people found the testimonies themselves in their entirety to be credible enough to basically attack anybody that was willing to buy fursuits from Don't Hug Cacti. And I have to say, my heart really goes out to not only the victims of emotional abuse and neglect, but also the people that had waited months and months to save up enough money to be able to get a slot on like in Don't Hug Cacti and to actually get themselves like a Don't Hug Cacti fursuit. And like they get their fursuit, and as soon as they get their fursuit, they get attacked by the mobs on Twitter, like the hate mobs. Like, damn, that's gotta be a very unhappy day. It's like you saved all that thousands of dollars, all that struggle, all that strife going back and forth with the people at Don't Hug Cacti, and you finally get the fursuit of your dreams. And what happens? It's like, you know, buying a fur coat like in front of a bunch of vegans that have red paint. They just smear the shit out of it, and they're just like, no, you are not going to enjoy that fursuit. We're going to make sure you don't enjoy that fursuit. And like a lot of people were just caught in the crossfire here. They had no idea as to who these people were, like the victims. They had no idea as to the personal interactions of Don't Hug Cacti. Well, don't like Lucky Coyote, who was like a central figure for Don't Hug Cacti. And like, you know, they just didn't know like the full scope of this, but they were definitely made aware of it after the fact because, yeah, there were like prominent fursuiters out there that would like to collect fursuits, and they would get mercilessly attacked by the hate mobs. And the problem with the hate mobs is if they were like blocked in any way, the perception would be like, oh, so they don't want to hear about how the victims were put through the ringer by Lucky Coyote. And if they argued with them, then it's like, you have no sympathy or empathy for the victims of this horrible individual. It's like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like, I sympathize with the victims just as much as anybody else does, but like at the same time, I'm not going to attack somebody for not knowing the full scope here. It's just very toxic behavior. Anyway. So, what about the evidence itself? What does this speak to? I hate to say, like, I personally, it's not beyond the suspension of disbelief to think that, like, Lucky Coyote might be guilty of at least half of what the testimonials themselves in their entirety are claiming. However, there are a lot of factors that we need to go over here, just to remain intellectually honest with ourselves. Number one, a lot of the testimonies boil down to a he said, she said sort of deal. Granted, the fact that, like, Lucky Coyote was willing to serve a cease and desist order as opposed to actually talking about this in full with the victims, tells me that she's got something to hide. That's one thing. Alright, so the testimonies in themselves, there's only one actual, like, case of sexual abuse, like, as in what's tantamount to sexual assault, where Lucky Coyote does something with somebody, and, like, they're too scared to say no. I can definitely see how people would be in the situation. Like, think about it this way. You are a young, impressionable furry, maybe 17, going into 18, and you're, like, out on the furry scene, and you see one of your idols. Your idol is willing to give you the time of day, like, treat you like you're the next best thing since sliced bread, and bring you back to their place. You have a moment of, like, private interaction with them. And then, you know, you're not quite ready for sex, but you don't want to, you know, disrespect your mentor, which is basically what Lucky Coyote had been to a lot of these people. Lucky Coyote was something of a mentor to a lot of these people that were giving testimonies, and the recurrent theme with a lot of these people is that they were relatively young in their interactions with Lucky Coyote. They had met Lucky Coyote when they were, you know, in their late teens, early 20s, but usually late teens. Usually around the ages of 16, 17 to 18. That's like basically where most of these people fall, although not in their entirety. But basically they looked up to Lucky Coyote. They wanted to draw art with her. They wanted to make fursuits with her. They wanted to enjoy her company. They wanted to be able to talk about anything and everything under the sun. They wanted to be as close to their mentor as humanly possible and to be a true blue friend. And Lucky Coyote in turn would treat these people as if, like, you know, they put them on a pedestal to get very close with them, but she would also employ a little something called hot and cold, which, if you've been in a relationship, you might have experienced a couple times. Hot and cold is basically where somebody gives you a lot of warmth and affection if you're doing things as they want you to do them. but the moment that you do anything that, or you don't give them what they want, they'll become mean and nasty and give you the cold shoulder, hence hot and cold. I've seen it in relationships, I've seen it in friendships, I've seen it, like, you know, amongst people throughout the furry fandom. And, you know, to cross Lucky Coyote, she would make issue of anything that you happen to be quote-unquote guilty of, and you would have to change that little issue for you to become friends again. And that's just how she operated, it seems like. I cannot attest with absolute certainty that Lucky Coyote is absolutely this way, because you have to bear in mind, these testimonials are going over a span of years. As in, like, the last moment that those two were friends was like years ago. And Lucky Coyote didn't really give anything for us to compare it to. You can easily see that she probably has something to hide. Like, for instance, if you go back to the podcast with Shiokami, she didn't go into great length on certain things. And in her personalized video, she just kind of ended the issue, like, with, no, I don't fuck animals. No, I don't abuse animals. No, that is crazy. Why would you say such a thing? And, you know, there comes a point where you have to wonder, like, who's really telling the truth here? Now, there have been some people that allege that both sides are actually guilty of wrongdoing, insofar as Lucky Coyote is guilty of, like, you know, using and abusing people for that feeling of closeness and that dopamine hit that you get when you're really close with somebody. And they said that the victims were just as wrong as Lucky Coyote for trying to exploit the issue for their own personal aims. Like, who's really getting what in this situation? It seems like this is actually just unresolved drama that was let to rest in the past, and that the victims, of their own accord, had the opportunity to meet other victims and cross-reference, like, oh, she did this same thing to you too? Oh, that's very enlightening. And she, like, Lucky Coyote is at least getting some of her comeuppance. Let's go ahead and talk about the more strange, unusual things here, because we're going to, like, skip into going into some of the material, and then we're going to meet at the end to sort of recap everything. I know this has been a very rambly video, but you gotta understand, it's been like at least a month since I've had exposure to all this, almost 2 months at this point, but I do want to, like, just sort of give a solid, like, you know, 2 cents on the matter and try to provide some sort of context for everything that has been covered up to date. So anyway, what I will say is that, you know, a lot of these testimonies, there are associations with some of the people, like, in the testimonials. A lot of the testimonials are anonymous. They're written under the condition of anonymity, as in we do not have a solid identity to some of the persona nicknames that they would pose. However, some people were very brash in their presentation of what they had to say. They would basically showcase who they actually were, so you could associate a name with a testimony, such as Nico, Ruby, and a couple others. And in relation to Lucky Coyote, what's curious is that, like, some of these testimonies, she would share certain intimate details, only with a couple of them. So let's go ahead and talk about zoophilia. The only indication of zoophilia I had, like, with Lucky Coyote, is that the claim is that she would share in confidence that she got fucked by the family dog, which was a German Shepherd. German Shepherds are fairly, you know, large, medium-sized dogs. Damn, like, fuck if true. But they're trying to also correlate this with the fact that her Fursona character has paw prints, like, on the hips. And that's supposed to, like, for those of you that don't know, in zoophilic, like, circles in the furry fandom, that's supposed to be a call sign that, hey, this is where, like, a dog would mount me, like, if I was having sex with a dog. And it's just like, damn. Now, I have to say, like, paw prints on the hips doesn't mean much, because, like, in the furry fandom, paw prints are everywhere. That could just be a personalized style, for all I know. But I will say that, like, I feel like it's possible, but at the same time, there's nothing else to go off of. Lucky Coyote denies it, but of course, anybody accused of anything like that is going to deny it. Possible that it happened years ago, but I don't think she's been keeping up with it. I don't think her husband would really appreciate if she's been keeping up with it, although we don't know. Like, there's only these claims, all right? there's no videos that have popped up, there's no photos that have popped up, and, you know, the claim's a very, very serious one to make, especially in light of the whole Kira the Wolf thing. So, let's hope not. But credible only insofar as people claimed it to be. And these were separate people, like, that have claimed this. These are not people that are, like, you know, co-opted, as far as I know. But there have been some associations with some of the victims. You don't see the claim pop up in many testimonies, is what I'm saying. Like, it's sporadic. But, you know, maybe... It's like, why would Lucky Coyote share that with people? I'm going to assume that she shared it, like, you know, hypothetically speaking, if she actually did, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that it was like, you know, a voice of trust. Maybe she felt comfortable to do so. Who knows? Honestly, some of these testimonies indicate that she shared drugs and alcohol with underage minors, like people that were below the age of 18. You know, depending on the state you're allowed to imbibe on alcohol. Drugs remain, you know, illegal, pretty much wherever they happen to be. Marijuana is legal under state law, but not under federal law, so just something to keep in mind. But I would imagine that if you're wondering why these people remain silent for so long, granted, the victims here definitely engaged in underage drinking and underage drug use, but Lucky Coyote provided them, or had means of providing them with underage, like, drinking and drug use. So who's at real fault here? Well, in that case, they're both at fault here. But, you know, sometimes when you're young, you're that impressionable. You're like, when in Rome, you know, why not sample local flavor? It just doesn't look good, though. Like, there was a film festival that Lucky Coyote took some people to, and drugs, alcohol were definitely involved there. Probably not the best look for Lucky Coyote, but maybe she was one of those wild children, just had to get her rocks off, go out, have parties. Also bear in mind, like, Lucky Coyote was probably in about 26 at the time. I think they're in their late 30s now. They've aged fairly well, I have to say, for everything they've been through. They've aged fairly well. Scuff Coyote made out like a bandit in that deal, but yeah. Like, you know, and also the people that she was engaging with at the time, like in her 20s, were with like 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds, so she was definitely hanging out with people that were young, so yeah, just something to bear in mind. She seems to have an affinity towards people that are young. I know that it's been pointed out to me that a great majority of the people in the furry fandom right now are fairly young, because, you know, they're caught in by the whole, like, walking, talking, fuzzy animal, like, veneer avatar thing, but, you know, that's besides the point. I know plenty of people that are in their 20s and in their 30s, so, you know, and I hang out with people that are usually in their 20s, you know, mid-20s, late 20s, early 20s, that little, like, sort of range there. That's most of the people that I hang out with, but that's just me. I mean, okay, I'm not saying that you can't be older and hang out with younger people, but there are certain boundaries that you absolutely cannot cross, and if you do, you're going to look very sus to the rest of the furry community. Like, you're going to look like a pedophile or a pedophoric, and you probably don't want that, so I'm just putting that out there. Just keep that in mind. My sincerest apologies for that jump cut. I really like to make these videos sort of one and done sort of deal, but occasionally FaceRig does not carry through with its promises of processing a video correctly, and I actually got cut off. So what I was going to say was I wanted to segue into the actual nature of the Google documents themselves. I'm actually going to show some screen caps, but I'm also not going to show everything in its entirety because it's a very big document. Basically, if you're wondering what it's titled, it's called Regarding Lucky Coyote, and it encapsulates all the various testimonials that people have been kind enough to submit forward, basically their side of the story. Now, it's important to bear in mind that only a few people are actually named. Actually, like, you can look them up and you can find a Twitter handle or some sort of username that can be tied to the testimonial that's being put forward. One thing to make mention of is that there is a TLDR section, which basically boils down everything into its least common denominator. So that's basically in the interest of conveying the information as quickly to you all as possible by the people that actually manage the whole Google Docs. What's interesting to note is that they actually include like a little clause where it's like, hey, if you have a personal story to put forth to, like, you know, about Lucky Coyote, if you have a personal story that you engaged with her at one point in your time, and, you know, it's credible enough, then we will post it here to be included with the others. Now, it has been suggested, like, in that, you know, in Shiokami's live stream video, that's like, you know, there was suspicion that people could like put forward a story that was absolutely fake, completely contrived and built from the ground up. What's important to note here about the testimonials, according to Lucky Coyote and a few other people, is that by and large, there's no like absolutely fake allegations. They have some grain of truth. It's just a question of perception. It's kind of like you get two Pokemon games, one red, one blue. There are subtle differences between the two, but you know, this is fairly black and white. So it's up for you to decide like who's credible here, Lucky Coyote or the testimonials from various people throughout the furry fandom. And me personally, I have to say that I find the testimonials to have some grain of truth, alright? Like, I'm willing to believe, like, at least halfway, meet the victims halfway, that some of the claims that they made about all this are, you know, are absolutely credible. But at the same time, it's important to make mention, before we actually go into it, that, like, these go over the span of years, and it's important to note that you're a different person back then than you are today. So that goes true for a lot of these victims, and it's hard to tell whether or not their memory is as good as they make it out to be. Like, you know, things could have been forgotten along the way. Things could be misremembered. Like, your perception today about a past, you know, event could be completely different from what you were feeling at the time that it happened. I'm not trying to like victim blame or anything like that, or completely discredit anything that people are claiming, but at the same time, there are factors to bear in mind whether or not you can take these testimonials at face value, or you should be taking them with a grain of salt. Me personally, I would recommend all of you take this with a grain of salt, because it does raise questions as to the veracity of these claims, you know? And again, these are claims. These are all, like, if I wanted to, I could write a blog about how Majira Strawberry groped me, like, when I was, like, 5 years ago. This didn't happen, obviously, but, like, if I wanted to. Now, that would raise a lot of questions, like, what convention was this, or what, like, occasion was this? Were there any people around? Did anyone see you associating with, like, Majira Strawberry? Were there any eyewitnesses to the event in question? Like, things like that. I just feel like people should weigh all of the information as it is available than just jumping to conclusions. And like, I know that we just got off the tail end of Kira the Wolf and that whole ordeal, but bear in mind, that was an accumulation of material over the span of years that people had the opportunity to cross-reference, pore over, and people that actually knew him either personally or as, you know, acquaintances in passing fancy could point out and like correlate certain things about the guy that were a little bit off. But obviously, that's not the subject matter of this video. I'm just saying that that's the most recent bout of drama, in which case information and material was actually very important on basing a decision on Kira the Wolf's guilt or innocence. Now we're weighing Lucky Coyotes, and I have to say, like, I don't think she's guilty of absolutely everything that's been claimed so far, but I do definitely believe, like, that she's guilty of at least half of them. So anyway, let's go ahead and go over this material, and then we're going to meet up at the end to talk about it in full and just sort of like recap everything that we know now and, you know, come to a decision then. So I will see you in a bit. Alright, so I would like to preface this by saying that Bear is not the first testimony that I read up to this point, in the very beginning. It was probably the third, fourth testimonial that I had read, but, you know, that's neither here nor there. The structure of all of this seems to shift a little bit, but I'll just go ahead and get into it. They met Lucky Coyote when they were 14 to 15 in 2012, 2013 years. How they met was basically through a message in which they had a chance to talk, and after that point, they would video chat inordinately, like as often as they possibly could. Basically to the point that they were smoking weed and making fursuits together all day, every day, anytime they got the opportunity for it. They make mention of Lucky Coyote's whole, like, hot and cold sort of behavior, where they would hold you in high regard as long as you were, you know, on the straight and narrow with them, but if you did anything to elicit their ire, you would have to make amends or apologize for it. Or she'd give you the cold shoulder or threaten to end the friendship. But yeah, What is strange is that, like I mentioned, they were 14 to 15 when they first met Lucky, and up to that point, Lucky offered to help them offer tips with, like, coming and being able to come and climax. And it was because they were going, through a bad relationship at the time, and Lucky just felt that they were probably sexually confused or needed some tips on how to improve their performance in bed. This is all like, there was a distinct mention of a moment where they had dildos and they were cleaning them while on, video chat, which is pretty awkward, but the author didn't feel like this was particularly unusual at the time because up to that point, they saw nothing about talking about not safe for work, topics of interest with an adult. But yeah, this all builds up to 2015 Midwest Fur Fest, in which case they actually happen to meet. And the author makes mention that they consider this the peak closeness that they were together. They turned 18 about a year, a few months later in March, and around June, they happened to go to a film festival, also known as the Electronic Forest Music Festival in June. This also overlaps with Todd's testimony, in which Todd is this rich friend that happens to basically bankroll the endeavor, and he offers a lot of financial support. Supposedly Todd is gay, has no interest in women, but except to hang out with them and have a good time. And, well, this is the first time that Lucky Coyote takes acid, and it's a very bad trip. It's implied that Bear, participated and partook in taking acid for the first time, but not for the first time. They've already been taking acid up to this point, but they decided to get in on it. It seems like they knew what they were getting into. There's no explicit mention of that, but you would assume, based on there being a film festival and all that, they'd probably get in on the action. Anyway, Lucky, this is a very embarrassing thing, if true for Lucky, because Lucky apparently was pissing on bushes, rocks, and things like that. If you're under the influence of drugs, I'm not surprised if you'd engage in very aberrant behavior, but basically Lucky had become paranoid, didn't trust anybody, they isolated themselves, and they had to be sort of monitored by Todd to make sure that they didn't hurt themselves. And when they went to the airport to try, they were planning on leaving, she basically approached the police and said, "Hey, I think I'm carrying some illicit material. Can you please confiscate this?" They turned over their drugs and, alcohol to the police, and then came back to the film festival. What I will say is that at the end of all of that, that sort of behavior, I guess, in front of Bear, Lucky Coyote probably got, I would say, embarrassed. I've been in situations where what would happen is that something very embarrassing or very tough to handle emotionally would happen, and it would make the relationship awkward after the fact. And when I say relationship, I mean, friendship. And, they just drifted apart after that, and it was really just kind of confusing to the author. So this is slightly out of order, but Todd's testimony actually goes hand in hand with Anonymous Bear's testimony that we read earlier, and Todd admits to being an older fellow that had met Lucky Coyote through the commissioning of a fursuit back in 2014. They are in their 30s, and they actually go into detail, initially describing Lucky Coyote very favorably, that her company is very prolific and well-known, that they've earned considerable influence through their creativity for over a decade, and that their fursuit company is admired because of the fursuits they've created for him and for the furry fandom at large. So back in 2014, when he commissioned the fursuit over email, they got to talking, and Lucky eventually ended up offering her phone number and asked if Todd needed a place to stay. And Todd would end up visiting the household a couple times, once in 2015 and once in 2016 is what they mentioned. And during those two times, Nico was present at least one of those occasions, living there. So this sort of corroborates the whole story of Ruby and Nico, because he also mentions that Lucky and Scuff would get into shouting matches and basically argue about things, and that there was actually an occasion that they were sitting, I guess, in the living room or the dining room, and they were recipient to hearing Scuff and Lucky argue about things, and he was sitting across from Nico, which made things a little bit awkward, but, it didn't really end the friendship. And they had often heard stories about, the rabbits being let loose in the backyard and becoming food for the local wildlife. They just felt like during their times that they would actually visit, there would be moments where he would be the only person in the house. It was as if everybody else in the household had just disappeared without rhyme or reason and leave him basically to his own devices for several hours. Not that he seems to really complain about that. One thing to mention before we get into personal details, he does go into length saying that what happens in a household between two consenting adults is their business and that he doesn't want to, I guess, sully the waters, as it were. But he does corroborate Anonymous Bear's story because he mentions, being the host at the film festival, I should say music festival, that they ended up going to. The highs were great because hanging out with Lucky Coyote, a prolific fursuit maker herself, it was it'd really boost the spirit, but the lows were just like that because for as high as you can go just as lower, if not lower than that, because Lucky Coyote was prone to having behavioral issues that were touched up on prior testimonies that we've already read up to this point. But I have to say, he goes to the film festival, the music festival with them, and he felt like it was kind of odd that Lucky Coyote would make the decision to bring an 18-year-old with them. And one morning before Todd had even woken up, both Bear and Lucky Coyote had taken a powerful psychoactive drug, LSD, also known as acid, and that over the next 4 days he could only describe it as a living nightmare. It was 4 days of a drug-induced psychosis that Lucky Coyote seemed to be in the grips of, and basically the event had to be spent babysitting her. And, Todd, recognizing that Lucky Coyote wasn't really having a good time, he tries to take her to the airport to get her a return home ticket. And she freaks out and, basically says to one of the TSA officers, "Hey, I think I might have drugs on me." And immediately the two are surrounded by police, and their luggage is searched top to bottom, but there were no drugs. There were no illicit substances in their luggage, so they end up going back to the going back to the music festival. And bear in mind, Lucky Coyote missed the flight. She obviously did not attend that flight, so that was several $100s, if not $1,000, out of Todd's pocket. But he's a fairly rich guy, prolific in his own way, and has the ability to expend money like that, so whatever. But Lucky ended up criticizing Anonymous Bear in private to Todd and laid the whole blame for the situation on them. And Lucky even refused to speak to Bear for the rest of the trip. So, as far as Todd's, his mentality, his perception of Anonymous Bear, he found her self-sufficient, friendly, and helpful. So, there's that. But he goes on to basically turn this into a sort of warning to the rest of the furry fandom that yes, there are people out there that have, great influence and that they become the envy of various other furries that want to hang out with them and spend time with them. But at the same time, for those young in the fandom, they should use their best judgment when engaging these kinds of people and going into these kinds of situations because things can often turn awry. So some of this testimony is partly what happened, but part of it's trying to give forewarning to anybody else in the fandom that might have been in Anonymous Bear's shoes. Because I'm sure most of us have been there at some point in our lives. But anyway. So Anonymous Fox's testimony actually makes specific mention of a incident between Lucky Coyote and Anonymous Fox. As you can see here, there's a content warning, basically warning of explicit content that's been described here. They go into painstaking detail about how sort of Lucky Coyote came onto them and helped them masturbate by fingering them, and sort of lashed out at them verbally when they showed signs of being uncomfortable. They were 19 at the time, so not underage. It wasn't the worst thing in the world, but at the same time, sexual assault is a pretty serious thing, and they make mention of how it kind of fucked them up mentally, over the years, to the point that they will not even wear a very high quality fursuit from Lucky Coyote, even though they paid for it and all that stuff. But anyway, so they don't make specific mention of how they met Lucky Coyote, whether it was through a message board or electronic service like AOL Instant Messenger. But they had gone close over the years. They spent a lot of time together, sort of talking and stuff. They seem to have been local because there was a point where they met, in real life, and they were supposed to go to a party, but instead of going to the party, they just ended up drinking at their, at Lucky's place. And Fox, they admit to underage drinking. The drinking age in Arizona would be 21. They were 19 at the time, so yeah, not entirely a good thing. They drank to the point of excess, in which case they threw up in the sink. But they stayed with Lucky Coyote that night, and apparently they were questioning their sexuality and their gender. They make specific mention of how Lucky Coyote would draw art for them, and the portrayal of this particular individual was, very femininely drawn, and they more felt like they were masculine. But anyway, they basically go into detail about how later on, Lucky Coyote offers to help them masturbate, and they didn't feel comfortable with that, but they couldn't say no at the time until later. They showed that they were just very uncomfortable, and Lucky Coyote actually yelled at them, saying that they wouldn't do anything with anybody without consent. And the author ended up faking an orgasm, Basically, they never felt like they were comfortable with being fingered or doing anything sexual in any way. When the question came up, it's like, they stated that they do not masturbate. So, Lucky Coyote had asked, what do you masturbate to? And they said that they don't masturbate at all. And it prompted Lucky to, quote-unquote, help them, achieve that. So, the sticking point here is that Lucky Coyote apparently bragged about it to all their friends after the fact, and the author stated how it actually went down, and they were actually accused by some of these friends of lying about it. And this is actually corroborated by another individual. We're going to get to them right after this. Basically, a note from Anonymous Raccoon. But all in all, this is the first time that we see mention of zoophilia, or the hints of zoophilia. Basically, Lucky Coyote shared with them in confidence, if you can believe this testimonial, that Lucky Coyote had sex with animals, and that they would explain in further detail why it was that they had paw prints on their character's persona, like paw pads on, tattooed to the hips. And that was apparently a flag to other zoophiles to indicate that they were also zoophile. Also, explaining how when they drew artwork, why it was so anatomically correct, and that why the penis on dogs was drawn as it would be on a real penis, as a real dog, as opposed to the furry anthropomorphic ones. But Lucky Coyote, to her credit, she says, claimed that she would never do it again, knows it's wrong, and would never consider having a big dog again. However, this was cause concern for the author of this testimonial because Lucky Coyote would later on get a German Shepherd. Pepsi, I believe they're called. But yeah, that's pretty much the nitty-gritty of all this testimony. So on the tail end of Anonymous Fox's testimony, we have Anonymous Raccoon's story, and basically the synopsis here is that they were one of the individuals that Lucky Coyote shared the Anonymous Fox story with, and was also 21 to 22 at the time. However, they admit that they're guessing because they don't remember quite clearly, but they do remember that they would have been 21 to 22 at the time. And they were also offered on multiple occasions to be helped masturbating, and was even sent a cheap vibrator as a gift. They ended up meeting at a small local furry convention, the name of which is not mentioned. However, they do mention that Lucky Coyote purchased a room for them. And when they woke up one morning, they found them on top of them, like Lucky Coyote was on top of Raccoon. And it was questionably appropriate physical contact. The most they did was snuggle up to them and be draped across their butt. So they do mention that. But at the same time, they verbally just declined Lucky Coyote's offer. And to establish their mindset at the time, they had just gone through a bad breakup at about the time that they had linked up, like right before. So it made things a little bit awkward that Lucky Coyote was, so forthcoming in wanting physical contact in perhaps a sexual way. But, it leads them to wonder how many people Lucky Coyote would have offered her help with, on top of, Anonymous Fox and Anonymous Raccoon. So, with regards to Anonymous Penguin's testimony, Anonymous Penguin makes mention that they were in a relationship with a person they refer to as B, and their story begins in 2018. Um, I'm going to assume that they are biologically female, but they and B were both 16 at the time when they first began to be contacted by Lucky Coyote. And Lucky Coyote by this time was well into her 30s. So they make mention that B was contacted by Lucky Coyote, and the two would basically, they just clicked. They happened to have a lot of conversations and talks together. And the impression that Penguin got was that Lucky Coyote was using them for various tasks like editing. I'm assuming that when they refer to editing, that they were referring to artwork, because editing could be editing short stories, novels, maybe video editing. It's hard to say, but basically they mentioned that they were doing a lot of editing for Lucky Coyote, and that they were very willing to do so because of the simple fact that Lucky Coyote was so well known at this point, and B was a relatively no-name individual. And occasionally Lucky Coyote would draw artwork for them and send it over, perhaps to showcase their friendship together. But yeah. And B actually goes off to see Lucky Coyote and travels about an hour to a hotel that she and her husband were staying at. And they make mention that Lucky Coyote didn't seem to know that B was actually underage. That it was coming as a shock to them when they actually showed up. But, in spite of that, they actually offer them weed, which is offering drugs to a minor, which is not a very good look for Lucky Coyote, but again, up to this point, if you are to believe the testimonials, you'd see that Lucky Coyote has been doing some shady stuff. But we actually get some screen caps here, forwarded messages from Telegram of, allegedly... Obviously, B is not their real name. They use this to sort of cover up their actual identity, but Lucko, it can be inferred, is Lucky Coyote. We don't know how the veracity of these screen caps, but it can be inferred based on their communications that they are referring to who they were. But yeah. Anyway, after meeting up with them, Lucky began to contact Penguin, and talk to them about things and offer them relationship advice. But Penguin never really accepted Lucky Coyote. They always felt they were a little bit weird for being, a grown woman talking to two minors, But yeah, basically they end things just talking about how the impression that they got based on what B would tell them is that Lucky would basically vent to them about a lot of things, basically their past relationships, and they treated it almost like lore. Like this is the past history of Lucky Coyote up to this point that they, would refer to, and, it really put them off. But what's interesting to note is that throughout Penguin's testimonial here, is that they make mention of B several times. They want nothing but the best for B, that they want nothing but good things to happen to B, and that they hope B, ends up, progressing very far through life, which is very weird, but I'm assuming that things between Penguin and B didn't go so well. So they're trying to impress upon the rest of us that they want nothing but the best for B, and that they can hope that B lives a long and fulfilling life. Anyway. Nico, Lucky Coyote. Alright, that was inappropriate. My apologies. Nico's testimony is a very long one. I mean, she basically mentions how she was in close association with Lucky Coyote for over 9 years, and there was a lot that happened within those 9 years. And, just from that alone, you can infer that they had a lot of close contact, that there were a lot of events that happened over the span of those 9 years. So there's going to be a lot of material for me to parse over here. Also, she goes into great detail, afterthoughts, after the fact. I'm going to save that for a later section of this video, but for right now, I just want to focus on their actual interactions together. Anyway, The story actually begins in 2010, and basically they had just turned 18. They commissioned Don't Hug Cacti, Lucky Coyote's fursuit business, for a fursuit partial, and they exchanged some comments over FA and Twitter. And while the author isn't entirely sure about this, they believe that they had a bit of an art trade when she was 17, just prior to them actually, engaging with Lucky Coyote in full. And it was over this time that they spent a lot of time talking together over, the phone for hours and hours on end, talking about anything and everything that came to mind. She was also the recipient, that is Nico, of a lot of gift art with them. Also, something that just completely slipped my mind. Nico, this is the first testimony so far that actually has a named individual. I've seen Nico's Twitter handle, and I know of them. However, I don't know them personally, so I just wanted to clarify that before we continue. But this is the first time, as opposed to seeing an anonymous testimony, you see somebody that's actually named. You can associate a name with the testimony. Alright, with that mentioned, they basically go into great detail about how special that Lucky Coyote made them feel, that their interactions together made them feel like they were on top of the world, that a lot of things that being in the good graces of Lucky Coyote did a lot to make them feel like they were unique, that Lucky Coyote, being so famous and popular throughout the furry fandom, would spend time with her. They also had a friend named Ruby, who also leaves a testimony after this one, but she and Ruby were both, friends. They were like best friends. And, one other thing to mention about Nico is that they had a lot of trans-masculine feelings, and that, Lucky Coyote would downplay that and, almost, I wouldn't say ridicule her, but almost denigrate the idea of having, trans-masculine feelings, basically saying, oh, you're just young. A lot of young girls have, wannabe boys. Anyway, what ends up happening is that they met together with Lucky at Anthrocon, shortly into the whole, their time together. And they get the feeling that Lucky Coyote would want to split her away from Ruby so that only Lucky Coyote and Nico would be spending an inordinate amount of time together. And that Ruby honestly felt left out. But Ruby became involved with someone that is not named in this document. However, it was an individual that Lucky did not approve or trust, and basically they convinced Nico that Ruby was a toxic and terrible person and needed to be, left out. So Nico and Ruby split. And it's after cutting out their best friend, essentially, Lucky would focus a lot of her attention on her. So this all built up. Also, it's important to mention that they were going to school at the time, and, being away from their parents, they started to speak over the phone a lot, like they used to. And it wasn't until 2012 that they visited Lucky Coyote's house for the first time. They received their full fursuit. They got the chance to party and hang out with a lot of popular furries. They went to Disneyland for the first time. And they were essentially taken care of by Lucky, because, Lucky would buy them, various meals. They would take them out for a good time on the town. They would have a lot of time to spend together. I didn't mention this yet, but Nico was apparently a fursuit maker and had aspirations of making fursuits to sell to other furries throughout the fandom. And it wasn't until the time about their third fursuit that they had made with the intentions of selling it that Lucky basically expressed extreme displeasure at this and felt that it looked too much like hers. And Lucky up to this point had been very encouraging of Nico's aspirations to be a fursuit maker. And this is the first time that they actively discouraged her and said, hey, why don't you focus on artwork instead? And the author basically capitulated and felt like they were forbidden to make fursuits at this point. So, it skips ahead a little bit, and in 2013, they're going to school, they converse at great length, they have a lot of time to sort of spend together, just in close association. They visit Lucky Coyote again in 2014, and to their surprise, Ruby is there. And bear in mind, Ruby was basically the subject of Lucky Coyote's ire, basically explaining to Nico that Ruby was a toxic individual, they were becoming a terrible person, that Nico needed to split ties with Ruby. So you can see how confused the author would be, at hearing all of this. So, regardless, it just goes ahead. Like, the whole experience ended up being, fairly, I don't know, like, interesting to say the least. But it wasn't until 2015 Nico actually became like an intern for Don't Hug Cacti with Lucky Coyote at the helm. And they remarked that it was a very miserable experience because Lucky and Scuff apparently had marital issues at the time. They were shouting and fighting a lot, and Lucky Coyote and Nico were supposed to be working on a fursuit pattern, like a football pattern, but Lucky gave up midway through and they ended up going to Califer instead. And it wasn't until later that like things just sort of progressed because following the trip, Nico didn't see Lucky in person for another 3 years. And they got the impression that Lucky and Scuff appeared to be having some financial difficulties at the time. It wasn't until 2018 that they made plans to go to Biggest Little FurCon, located out in Reno, Nevada. And Lucky Coyote persuaded Nico to spend thousands of dollars to go to BLFC and to be with her, for the full time they were going to go, Thursday to Sunday. And it wasn't until 2019 that they, like Nico, actually returned to Arizona to be the guest of honor for a local convention. They didn't mention the specific convention by name, but I'm going to infer based on that it was probably a small convention. Lucky did not invite her to stay, at her house, and they only hung out a few times. And altogether, Nico mentions that this is the first time that Lucky Coyote gave the impression that she didn't really seem to want them around. So it was in the summer of 2019 that they planned to go, to see a friend, I believe Wallaby, out in Australia. And Lucky was going to an Australian FurCon to be a guest of honor. And the problem is that Lucky made no efforts to meet with Nico or talk to her, and every time that Nico would offer to link up for lunch or have a meal together to catch up, Lucky would make excuses about why they couldn't meet up, basically saying they were too busy to do so. And, they happened to, Nico called them in 2019, and it was the second to last time that they had ever made a call together, and Lucky basically admitted that she doesn't talk to any of her friends anymore, and that she doesn't want anyone knowing her or being too close to her or to know too much about her. And the author believes that the reason for this was because Lucky Coyote was not wanting anyone to really know the real Lucky, quote unquote. Lucky ended up calling about 2 days before her next birthday just to catch up, see what was going on. And it was the last time they ever talked. During that conversation, Lucky dropped the N-word fairly casually. And when Nico sort of raised, basically being protest, she would basically facetiously say, "Oh, that's a bad word. I can't be saying that," but then continued anyway, which led Nico to believe that, and she doesn't remember the context why she used the N-word, but she was led to believe that Lucky Coyote would use this word fairly casually in conversation. And later on, the two met at Midwest Fur Fest in 2019, and basically they both had a booth there. Now, Nico couldn't help but feel that Lucky Coyote didn't really want her there and was behaving very artificially towards her, almost to the point that was a creepy sort of interaction they had, because it was artificially nice, artificially friendly, but there was no substance to their interaction. And a few days after MFF had ended, she found that her entire chat history on Telegram was deleted. Now, the author tries, Nico tries to reach out to Lucky Coyote to find out what she did wrong, to try to make amends, to try to reconnect, but Lucky Coyote read the message and never responded. And ever since then, Nico had the opportunity to engage with a lot of the other victims up to this point and to sort of parse over and try to assess, through her own efforts, whether or not, this was a repeated pattern for her. And she walked away with a greater newfound understanding and awareness of how Lucky Coyote had treated other people. She does mention that I should say they. Sorry, I keep saying she. They mentioned that Lucky Coyote had, never mentioned to them that they were a zoophile, and that Nico, themselves, never had any knowledge of Lucky being a zoophile. But we'll revisit, the more personal aspects of her testimony later, or their testimony later, I should say. But, because a lot of this, as you can probably tell, it's very voluminous. But it ties in with Ruby, because this is the same Ruby that was close friends with Nico once upon a time. Anyway, So, on the tail end of Nico's testimony, and bear in mind that Ruby was Nico's best friend at one point in time, we have Ruby's testimony, and basically there is a sort of relationship between Ruby's testimony and Nico's testimony because they were friends. They both met Lucky Coyote at roughly the same time. And, they basically mentioned that they feel themselves to be a personal victim of Lucky Coyote, and that for a very long time they were afraid to speak out because of the clout that was behind Lucky Coyote as such a prominent figure in the furry fandom. However, they were 17 at the time of their initial meeting at Anthrocon with Nico, and, mentioned slightly that Nico was picking up a fursuit at the time. And after Anthrocon is when Ruby began to drift away from Nico, which prompted some, concern and confusion, but at the same time, that to be because of Nico's testimony. And then they found out later that Lucky was actually telling lies about Ruby to other people as well as Nico. So that prompted some, odd, reaction to that. But it was at the age of 19 they actually moved to Phoenix, Arizona from Montana to be with their ex-boyfriend. They would be exes later. But they moved in with a boyfriend later to be ex, but that was how they were sort of formally introduced to Lucky Coyote after a span of time. And the ex had a falling out with Lucky, and the ex basically wanted Ruby to not have any more contact with Lucky. But Ruby didn't follow that advice and basically continued to spend a lot of time with Lucky Coyote and her husband, Scuff. She mentions that they spent a lot of time together, basically would work on fursuit projects and helped out with Lucky, I guess with her fursuit making business, and that throughout this time she had several breakups with her boyfriend. And it's important to mention that because that could establish that she was in a very tumultuous state, emotionally, and that could be... It's a recurrent theme with a lot of these testimonies that Lucky Coyote would try to separate people and to basically, latch onto them when they were emotionally vulnerable and in a vulnerable state. But anyway, it was during this time that she also began to notice that, Lucky Coyote was beginning to show signs of, the inconsistencies in her behavior as well as the speech patterns in lying. And that she strangely went into a lot of detail about people that she didn't like and seemed to take great joy in the fact that they would not be doing so well, or if any travesty would happen in their personal lives or any problems would arise, she would seem vindictively malicious in that sense. But anyway, she saw her scream at her husband several times, only for her to do a complete 180 when her husband would do things like bring her flowers or capitulate to her demands. And strangely when they were at the household, Lucky, without knocking on the door, would actually come in to invade Ruby's privacy. But, if Ruby did the same, Lucky Coyote would, lash out and call her inconsiderate. And her excuse when she did it, like Lucky did it, was that, they were so close as friends that, she felt fully comfortable with that. But it was a very one-way sort of ordeal. Also, the author mentions throughout all of this that, both Lucky Coyote and Scuff made fun of Ruby's interests on YouTube, like her channel and whatever interests she happened to have. They didn't seem to take LGBT couples seriously at all, in favor of straight couples, man and woman. But this prompted Ruby to basically make her YouTube channel private, and she'd have to just leave the house sometimes just to get away from them. And Ruby would sometimes throw parties in the area because Lucky would constantly complain about the fact that she was never invited to the big parties that were out and about. And in spite of doing so, Lucky would act very disinterestedly whenever she would attend these parties, basically not participating in any activities and pulling away to be by herself. There's one account where she had brought, a bottle of wine and a box of pizza and just ate it behind the couch, which seems fairly awkward to me. But hey, stuff would happen. Anyway, there were occasions later that, Ruby and her husband, Lucky's husband, Scuff, would go out and basically have, sojourns into town to have coffee or bagels and just be away from Lucky Coyote. And what's strange is that Scuff would actually mention, hey, don't mention this to Lucky Coyote, keep her out of it. And Scuff is actually one of the people that, like her boyfriend, would give her the quote-unquote guidebook on how to deal with Lucky and her, inconsistent, erratic behavior insofar as her emotional state. Basically, the whole hot and cold thing. Hey, just give her what she wants and stay out of her way, and you can remain in her good graces. But, yeah, Ruby was practicing parkour with Scuff sometimes, and this actually, when Lucky found out about it, she actually accused Ruby of trying to seduce her husband during these parkour sessions. And it was later that Ruby happened to notice that Lucky Coyote acted very artificially towards her, and it basically ended up like that Ruby left for San Diego and never really got back in touch with Lucky. And what's strange is that, even the author mentions that she never really understood where she stood with Lucky Coyote as far as friendship goes, because Lucky Coyote never blocked her or removed her from her friends list or, throughout social media. She didn't delete the chat logs, as far as I'm aware. But they never felt that the friendship ended, but Scuff did block her on Twitter and other forms of social media years after the interaction, I guess leading up to the creation of the Google Docs. So definitely some strange behavior going on there leading up to that. But yeah, they would also mention that Lucky Coyote seemed to love starting drama and basically like to facilitate conditions and situations that would be unamicable for everybody around her, just so she could sit back and watch the chaos unfold. Her words, not mine. At least I reinterpreted them but that's basically the message she was trying to convey. It's not beyond the suspension of disbelief given what we know about Lucky Coyote, but again, these are the claims of Ruby and some other individuals throughout this Google Doc. And I don't know, so many people saying roughly the same thing in not so many words. Maybe they're being critical of Lucky Coyote, but there's definitely some behavioral issues there in how she socializes with others. But we'll continue with the reading. So Tally's testimony is very ambiguous as to how they actually met Lucky Coyote and how they became to be friends, but they do mention that they knew Lucky Coyote for several years, and basically explain that Lucky Coyote seems very black and white. She accepts no criticism and is very quick to criticize those around her. And anytime that there's a concern or request, she would get very dismissive and was somewhat mean. She would be verbally and emotionally abusive to Tally, and Tally was just expected to take it and accept that as the norm of their relationship together. Relationship as friendship, just to clarify. And basically, Tally, like so many others in this document, was cut off after so many years from friendship without any explanation. Anything that Tally would share with Lucky Coyote in confidence was freely shared with other people, and even though the implication was that Tally was expecting that Lucky Coyote would be able to, be discreet and keep secrets among friends, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. Basically, she seems to be maliciously vindictive, Lucky that is. She enjoyed when others had experienced hardship. And there was also, in engaging with other people, Lucky Coyote seemed to be roughly aware of how problematic her communications could be, and she would rarely say anything of importance or, I guess, a serious nature in writing. Anywhere that, something could be screen capped or forwarded, she would avoid to, basically write anything down that could be potentially damaging for her later on. But yeah, this is the first time that we really see signs of animal abuse and neglect, because Lucky Coyote would acquire animals. For instance, in this one, she's mentioning that she acquired a cat and a puppy, and the cat had behavioral issues, and she promptly gave him away. The puppy had behavioral issues and also some health issues from birth, but she didn't want to take care of it because it was annoying, like for her to do so. And there was also mention of a parrot, a small bird. The small bird ended up dying under mysterious circumstances, and Lucky Coyote would tell a different story to various other people as to how it died, you know. But Tally mentions how, Lucky Coyote loves to love bomb people, that she had rabbits in her backyard. And given the state of Arizona, having so many predators in the form of coyotes and various other wildlife in the backyard, it was strange to her that Lucky Coyote would have all these pets relatively unsecure, and they would, escape and end up, getting eaten by local wildlife. So, I don't know. It's certainly concerning. She also makes mention of the fact that Lucky Coyote seems to treat pets like disposable accessories, which might explain why she treats people the way she does. But, relatively short testimony in comparison to the others so far, but this is the first time we really see tangible mention of animals and animal abuse and neglect. But anyway, all right. So Raven Fox's testimony is another long one, and it's another one where they happen to meet Lucky Coyote when they were a relatively young age, at the age of 16. So they mentioned that they met Lucky Coyote at 2008, that 16 years of age was when they came into being in the furry fandom, and that they had moved to Phoenix from Chicago, and that they had a friend from high school that they referred to as Kay throughout the story. Now, Kay would introduce Raven to, locals, basically Lucky being one of them, and they would end up hanging out at Lucky Coyote's apartment, with a lot of other people. So they mentioned that their initial perception of Lucky Coyote was that she was very full of herself, that you couldn't disagree with her on any topic of interest or discussion, and that she would absolutely not accept criticism. However, Raven would get along fairly well with her husband Scuff, and because they shared similar interests. And Kay and Raven would end up assisting Lucky Coyote with the fursuit making business, sewing fursuits to help Lucky Coyote out. And throughout that all, they would hang out a lot, go to the mall, when they were done sewing or, measuring or doing other fursuit making things and activities, and would just enjoy themselves. But Raven would end up actually becoming an employee for Don't Hug Cacti. Now, the problem with Raven is that they didn't have a car, so they had to rely on Kay for rides, but later on, Scuff would actually occasionally give them rides, and they hung out with Lucky and Scuff a lot after this. Now, Kay would end up getting jealous and begin to spread rumors about Raven, and Lucky would kind of distance the group, Kay out of the group for being kind of toxic. Now, what's interesting is that Raven also mentions that the Pomeranian dog, species of dog, Tricky, had passed, but up to that point, they noticed that the dog was sick and that they would often have seizures, and that Lucky was either unwilling or unable to deal with it. And they also got rid of Sparta. And up to the point when they got rid of Sparta, another dog, Sparta was constantly getting yelled at, and Lucky, would make mention in passing that they didn't want them anymore because he got in the way. But after all of this, they would hang out together, Lucky and Raven, and they would draw and work on artwork together. Now, this elicited a negativity from Lucky because Raven started to adopt the similar art style to Lucky's, and, Lucky would make a big deal out of this, feeling that her art style was being copied and that she was absolutely insulted by it. Scuff would downplay the situation, saying Lucky was ridiculous and sort of being on Raven's side on this. But, one particular incident in this case, like how petty Lucky would be, is that Lucky and a friend came up with the idea of scrappy badges, basically scrapbook badges, and Lucky emphasized that was her idea, but it would end up coming out that was both Lucky and the friend's idea. But both Kay and Raven would make, scrappy badges, going to Michael's, procuring the supplies, putting stuff together, and when they posted online, Lucky would actually make a passive-aggressive comment about it, and would audibly complain about how her ideas were being stolen. Raven ends up taking down, the post online because they didn't want to evoke the ire of Lucky Coyote. So one day, Scuff goes to play golf, leaving Raven, and Lucky Coyote alone in the apartment. And Lucky just sort of opens up with what Raven's fetishes and kinks are. And up to that point, the author mentions that Lucky had made a habit of talking about sexualized topics. Bear in mind, Raven was still, a minor at this point. And it was like through conversation that Lucky would just randomly bring up that she had zoophilic tendencies, that she had sex with her family's German Shepherd, like when she was younger. And this obviously left the author fairly shocked, and Lucky would just continue, in spite of the fact that, all the author could really do at this point is just nod her head and just be like, okay. Until, Scuff came back and took them home. Raven would mention this to Kay, and Kay had a little reaction because it's just like, okay, whatever. And Raven was led to believe, because they were still fairly naive about the inner workings of the furry fandom, she felt like this was absolutely normal. So it's like, whatever. But yeah, Lucky and Raven continue to hang out a lot, with Kay occasionally being invited, but sometimes not. They mentioned that going to Olive Garden for like a prominent dinner, and that Lucky would often love bomb her, being very friendly, touchy-feely, and that like later on, Kay would get a boyfriend named H, and both would groom Raven, with attention over time. Lucky would take advantage of this by trying to isolate Raven and basically talk about sexualized topics more frequently. But Kay basically gets jealous of the attention that H would give to Raven, and to the point that she begins to physically abuse him, and did not approve of the sharing of Raven. So H kept contact with Raven in spite of Kay's disapproval, but this culminated into, Kay finding out about it. And one day, Raven finds out that, like, nobody is talking to her anymore. She has effectively been cut out of the group. And it was pointed out to her later that Lucky found out about the whole three-way, like, sort of interactions between Raven, Kay, and H, and basically labeled Raven a terrible person for it. And that, like, she was the type of person to go out and try to steal people's partners. So the entire group joins in, like the people that hung out with Kay join in and basically scapegoat Raven for everything negative that went on in that group. And the author ends up with just mentioning that they spent 12 years in fear and isolation, that nobody would give her the time of day or listen to her side of the story. Because Lucky would always take precedent. Everybody wanted attention from Lucky. They would always think about Lucky Coyote and what she would want. And, they just felt like Lucky Coyote would end her, her standing in the furry fandom, any chance of having social contact with any other furry again, if Lucky Coyote were to find out about her. So, yeah, it speaks to behavior, but again, we're going to go into greater detail about all this as a sort of summary after all these individual testimonies are gone over. So, let's continue. So, Anonymous Horse's testimony is another one of those testimonies that are quote-unquote short, sweet, and to the point. They don't go into explicit detail on how they met Lucky Coyote. They don't go into particular details on their unique interactions together, but they mention that they were friends with them for about 4 years, between the years of 2010 to 2014, and that they would just go into detail about her particular interactions with people overall. That Lucky Coyote seemed to be the type of person that liked to pit people against one another as a sort of puppet master. That they would be a drama monger and try to make the quote-unquote puppets dance to her whims. And that she'd go out of her way to create unfavorable conditions for those around her to laugh at what problems it would cause after the fact. And that she loved throwing people under the bus. And even those that she would probably consider a close friend, she would still share intimate details about with others. And she seemed to go out of her way to try to destroy Ruby, which we mentioned already. This is about the time where we get another mention of, potential incidents of animal abuse, and that, they must have been on fairly good terms because, Anonymous Horse had Lucky Coyote over at her house, or their house. And, the particular incident that was sort of eyebrow-raising is, she came over with animal bites and scratches all over her arms. And that when questioned about it, Lucky's excuse was that her rabbit was experiencing bloat and she decided to kill it with her bare hands to alleviate its suffering. supposedly. The problem with that is, like, typically you would do that by taking it to a veterinarian, but, Lucky didn't just decide to do it herself. And the scratches and bites should be indication enough that the rabbit actually wanted to survive, that was fighting for its life. But, so it goes. And Lucky basically listed the rabbits on Craigslist. Nobody wanted them, so she let them go free in her backyard. And what ended up happening is that she mentioned, almost with a hint of excitement, that she could hear the screams of the rabbits being carried off by owls or hawks. And which is kind of concerning, but alright. She ended up getting a macaw parrot, but shortly after getting it, she didn't want it anymore because it was making too much noise, basically screeching and behaving abnormally with seizures. She couldn't get rid of it on Craigslist, and the breeder refused to take it back. And like what ended up happening, the story that she pitched was that she was going to be moving to an apartment. And that's problematic because people have gone out of their way to mention that Lucky never moved. So it's like, what? But anyway, another thing that they would mention is that they mentioned the dog Pepsi. And Pepsi, I believe, is a German Shepherd, but, I haven't seen pictures of these pets. I only see mentions and names and descriptions, so. But Pepsi would basically be teased and, by Scuff and Lucky Coyote. Like, whenever it was sleeping, they would, grab its butt while it was asleep, and it would be, so terrified by the incident they would go off screaming and barking, I guess. But another note that was added by Ruby is that they would make this particular pop noise with their mouth, and what was strange to Horse is that, like, the way the dog reacted was an absolute terror. Like, it would just put her tail down, sort of look down and just slink out of the room. It was absolutely terrified, which is certainly weird for a dog to behave that way to something as innocuous as a pop noise, but maybe there was a reason for it. Anyway. So Anonymous Goose's testimony is perhaps like one of the shortest that I've read so far, and it goes into more detail about how Lucky would engage with people physically when in a environment like a convention, a furry convention space. But they go off and start and mention that they were 20 to 21 at the time that they met Lucky Coyote at a convention, and like one of the defining moments was that Lucky Coyote had basically pinned them down on the floor and were over top of them. And they didn't really take it seriously. They just, made posts on social media about how they caught a cute puppy. And, the author can't help but remark that the first time that they met, that Lucky Coyote was very touchy and feely. Basically, she would grab somebody, drag them into her lap, kiss their neck, kiss their face, hug all the while, hold hands. They would shield the person with their body so the individual couldn't really physically contact anybody else. And, they used the phrase aggressively touchy. And bear in mind, they had never met before, so Goose was the recipient of this behavior. And they felt scared and uncomfortable about their interactions more after the fact than, like, the actual event itself. And from what it was described, the author seems to imply that they were of European descent and that Lucky was possibly attending a European convention. But as far as the extent of their interactions go, after that they would spend hours and hours on end, like talking over the phone and, getting closer, and they felt like they were being love bombed after a while, like looking back on all this, because that's what Lucky Coyote would do. That love and affection was shared freely between them. However, they felt special about this because it was from an artist they admired, and this artist, being Lucky Coyote, was taking such a keen interest in them. However, they felt distant, like after the fact, because of the author's own personal circumstances. They don't go into great detail about what happened, but Lucky seemed to have lost interest in Goose entirely, which concluded their interactions together up to this point. So Anonymous Frog's testimony is another one of those short ones that focuses more on a particular incident, as well as, little quirks about Lucky's mode of character in relation to her customers and fans. And they admit that they don't really have anything to say about Lucky personally, but they will say that they experienced a terrible instance of behavior on her part. So there have been repeated instances of exposure on how bad her customer service attitude and behavior can be, and she seemed very ungrateful for those that would patronize her business, don't hug cacti. She seemed to lack a fundamental desire to engage with her fans or customers in a positive way, and would basically delegate anything like customer service or PR to her husband Scuff. Now, there was a particular convention. Unfortunately, they don't mention which convention this was. Could have been Anthrocon for all I know. But that, Lucky attended, and Frog was in attendance, and they were supposed to go to a photo shoot. And Lucky basically breaks down and is just muttering under her breath how she hates her customers, that, she was quote-unquote seething with rage by the author's own description, at the prospect of attending this event. Now, after some reassurance and insistence by the author, like Frog, they did end up attending the event, and they just sucked it up and put on a good show for her fans and customers. But and bear in mind, this photo shoot was to celebrate Lucky Coyote. It was one of those themed photo shoots that you sometimes see, like a meetup at conventions, where people of a particular style or species of fursuit will link up and put on a little bit of a show. They'll put on a pose for the camera and take a photo shoot. But all Frog could really be thinking throughout all of this is that Lucky Coyote underneath that fursuit head was probably seething with rage and incessant anger at the fact. But anyway. Alright, so for Anonymous Ferret's testimony, this is so short I could probably just read this. Blonde Foxy, Lucky, used to brag to people about urinating on the personal belongings and clothing of an ex-friend as quote-unquote revenge. I do not remember the name of said friend, though it was someone she was very close with in their clique. It may have been an ex-roommate. It was really disgusting, but she seemed very proud of this. I am only sending this information because of the part in the Google Doc about even minor stories and information possibly corroborating other accounts, and I know she has told this story to several people. I hesitate because it's not as bad as the other things she's done, but it shows more about what kind of person she is. Okay, so peeing on things to get back at somebody. Very immature, but I'm trying not to, impart too much of my 2 cents on the matter until later. So let's continue. So Anonymous Cat's testimony basically sees to them mentioning off the bat that they're no longer active in the furry fandom, and that the distance that they put between them and the furry fandom has done wonders for their mental health. But they were one of the individuals that was negatively impacted by Lucky Coyote during their initial dealings. And they admit that they were never particularly close to Lucky Coyote. However, from the time that they met, they recognized Lucky Coyote's artificiality and problematic behavior from the very beginning. But it was around 2008, 2009 that they met, various artists and fursuit makers throughout the furry fandom, and that they spent a lot of time talking with these individuals, and they happened to be 18 to 19 years old at the time. Now, multiple people, as a topic of interest, would mention Lucky Coyote, and they would basically mention zoophilic tendencies as well as her business practices being more of a reflection on how she personally felt somebody. So, for instance, if Lucky Coyote didn't personally like you, and you commissioned her for a fursuit, she would intentionally make you a shoddy fursuit, to reflect that she didn't like you. Stands to reason, right? But the author basically admits that the whole zoophilic tendencies thing, they actually ended up being close to several people that ended up being outed as zoophiles later on with video evidence to prove it. So, and with the whole Kiro the Wolf thing, being relatively close on everyone's mind, it's not outside the suspension of disbelief to see that as being the case. I mean, it's a surprise to everyone. But anyway, it was about 2011 that they went to a particular convention. They mentioned it might have been Anthrocon, however, they're not entirely sure which particular convention this happened to be, but they were rooming with somebody from Lucky's inner circle. So they go to a jam room party, and Lucky and other furry artists are in attendance, and Lucky appeared to be overtly friendly at this party. And, she just, in passing conversation, refers to her clientele in a very negative light. So she just passively said, "Hey, I have no problems giving a bad fursuit to someone if I don't like them." So this was around the time that somebody at the convention actually received a fursuit directly from Lucky Coyote as a delivery. And after she left to get drinks, the recipient of said fursuit happened to be in the room to show it off. And various people throughout the room party basically pointed out the shoddy craftsmanship that went into the making of the fursuit. They pointed out subtle flaws and more major ones, but the individual, as if in blind loyalty, offered forced praise to Lucky Coyote out of loyalty, in spite of people mentioning how poor quality the fursuit was. Now, what's interesting to note about this is that shortly after the convention, Lucky Coyote actually stopped posting on social media about the other artists in the room. So that leads me to believe that she possibly found out that they were critiquing her handiwork, pretty, critically. But it was about a year after that the author's friend, I should say, they got a new suit for Anthrocon, and they were friends with Lucky and wanted to spend time with her, so the author joined. So the author's fursuit was made by a friend, and Lucky made a point to give the author tips about how they could improve it, and talked about how she could do a better job in contrast. And, Lucky offered the author her number and basically told them that they should hang out, complimented them on their artwork. But the author always had reservations on this because Lucky Coyote felt just a little bit too nice. And in spite of receiving several pieces of gift art, her characters are always shown in a very suggestive light. And, they basically had been through abusive relationships before, and she began to see the warning signs after she was being love bombed. She was just very uncomfortable to be recipient to such, keen interest by Lucky Coyote in such a short span of time. But in 2013 to 2014, Lucky Coyote seemed to make passes at them, and they were approached later on by Lucky Coyote herself to ask if they remembered her. And while the author answered flatly yes and went about their business, they were never bothered again after that point. So I guess Lucky Coyote got the hint that the author, Anonymous Cat, was not interested. So Anonymous Wolf's testimony starts in 2012-2013, and they basically mentioned how they inquired about a German Shepherd fursuit called Sugar. I'd also like to mention, before we continue, that this focuses more on the shady business practices of Don't Hug Cacti and how they were sort of interlinked with the actions and behaviors of Lucky Coyote herself versus, anything like sexual assault or flirtatious behavior or problematic behavior apart from bad customer service. Just saying that, for the record. But anyway, the author inquired about a German Shepherd fursuit called Sugar, and Lucky seemed very excited to complete the sale. So the author had the money to complete the sale, just needed a measurement done to ensure that the body would fit, and almost immediately after mentioning this, Lucky Coyote goes silent, and 8 hours later, just mentions in passing that the fursuit ended up being sold. So disappointed, the author moves on. Lucky began to get a little bit pushy about recommending buying another one of the fursuits that were pre-made that didn't sell. So the author capitulated and was asked by Lucky Coyote to send a duct tape dummy for modifications. The payment is sent, and the suit arrives less than a month later. The fursuit is very large compared to the author. This could fit a fully grown man, 6'3", 245 pounds, versus the author, who's only 5'6". And immediately, the author reaches out to, Don't Hug Cacti, aka Lucky Coyote, just for, to be helped with this issue, and they're referred to someone named Swifty. Swifty is referred to as one of Lucky Coyote's fake email aliases, and they basically have rude customer service interactions with Swifty. They're referred back to Lucky Coyote, and Lucky Coyote states, quote, "Unfortunately, this body is way too complicated for one person to make. It was made by a team of professionals and cannot be reproduced. The fur patterns were very simple, that an alteration shouldn't be very difficult. For instance, there was only a white spot on, had a white stomach, so it shouldn't have been that difficult. But anyway, the author just asked for what type of fabric was used so that alterations could be made. And this elicited an argument between Swifty and Lucky and the author before Lucky Coyote's husband named Scuff gets involved. Scuff, I mentioned him several times. Scuff tells the author what fur was used, and that was the end of that. But a year later, the fursuit was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. For instance, the fursuit paws were worn, and the author wanted it refurbished. So Lucky insists on them buying a new one for like $1,800. And so they gave up on that, and they ended up reaching out to Don't Hug Cacti about a vixen-like fursuit later. Now, the package arrived without warning or tracking, but the suit was absolutely gorgeous. However, shortly after receiving it, the author was contacted by somebody from Fur Affinity that claimed that they and Lucky had an agreement that they were going to meet in person for like a cash exchange for the fursuit. And this made the author feel embarrassed and upset. And she felt too guilty to wear it and ended up selling it like a year later to the individual that was supposed to receive the suit in the first place. And when she inquired about why this happened, nobody at Don't Hug Cacti had an answer for him. So in 2015, they saw Scuff's old fursuit listed for sale with a refurbished custom fursuit head, and the author wanted to buy it. So they reached out, made some custom requests. Lucky ignored all the custom requests made from the author about what fabric to use, eye color, ear notch, hair tuft, etc. And the suit shows up without warning. Fursuit was unwashed. The claws were already falling out, the body was matted up, head was nice, but not quite what the author wanted, and she ended up taking this to Furry Week in Atlanta, but upon putting it on, she felt like the body smelled horrible. That the fur had a gross, sort of sweaty film to it, and the inner body was basically itchy and gave the author rashes and bumps, even when wearing Under Armour. And right out of the box, 7 of the claws fell out and were lost on taking it out of the box. By the end of the convention, all 7 were gone. So they ended up making the alterations to the fursuit themselves, trying to refurbish it, and they ended up selling it off. And from that point onwards, the author had nothing to do with Don't Hug Cacti or Lucky Coyote's fursuit making business. Anyway, the author had a friend named Jay who had an experience with Lucky Coyote as well. They saved money for years to be able to afford to buy a fursuit, and Lucky accepts Jay's fursuit commission, but they only, throughout their entire time that they engaged with one another, they only offered one work in progress, picture, just as a progress report on how this fursuit was going. And it only showed the base. So they end up getting the fursuit later, and it was after 2 years, of waiting. There was only one work in progress picture that was provided. But upon receiving it, the suit just kind of showed up out of the blue one day. But after receiving it, the character that was the fursuit was not the individual's, Jay's character at all. The markings and colors were all changed, except for the mark on the nose. And when asked why, Lucky Coyote responded that the original reference was ugly and would not match the style of the company, so it was simplified to make it easier to wear. And Jay doesn't wear the fursuit anymore, and he's hardly involved with the furry fandom. He doesn't like how artists changed his character and called it ugly. And, they remain anonymous, the author remains anonymous, because they don't want to be targeted by members of Lucky Coyote's inner circle or the furry fandom at large. And they just couldn't help but feel that Lucky Coyote's bad customer service attitude and business practices ruined her perception of the company Don't Hug Cacti. And that of 8 professional fursuit makers that she was, engaging with, Don't Hug Cacti had the worst offerings up to that point. So yeah. So Hoku Tiger's testimony basically begins about 8 to 9 years ago. They mention a fursuit character named Sky that Lucky apparently made for them. And they had a quote-unquote crazy abusive ex. Now both were at Anthrocon, years ago, and they were both approached by Lucky Coyote to take a picture with the ex's lightsaber, and from that point onwards throughout the night they happened to hang out with Lucky. They went to the zoo, which if you don't know what the zoo is, it's basically a common area for people to meet and socialize with other people. But yeah, and from that point onwards they sort of talked online sporadically, mostly through comments here and there, using the shout system on Fur Affinity. But later on, They expressed the desire to have Danny made. Danny is another fursuit character that they wanted to have commissioned, but Lucky wanted to make that character for Hoku, but Hoku couldn't afford to commission Lucky Coyote with it. Instead, they had a close friend make it, which made Lucky Coyote very angry at being deprived the opportunity to make a fursuit. But 2 years after that, Hoku and her ex break up, and it leaves the author in a severe state of PTSD. Now, Danny was sold off, and it basically gave the author enough money to perhaps commission Lucky Coyote. And they end up adopting a character from Lucky Coyote named Sky. And, upon commissioning Lucky Coyote, they begin to talk over the phone all the time. I mean, Lucky Coyote gives her phone number out to people that she has a good feeling about. And Lucky even began to draw gift art for Hoku. Now, in spite of the author having a bad breakup, Lucky would often go into great detail about her own relationship with Scuff and how wonderful it was to be in love. Now, the author receives Sky through the mail, and it's just out of the blue at random, and when they unpackage it, they have to hide their disappointment upon seeing the head because the fursuit partial that they ordered seemed kind of rushed. The eye dots were airbrushed instead of sewn on, the ref sheet was not followed by at all, and when the author mentions it, Lucky got very snippy with the author. Basically went with 2D eyes instead of 3D eyes as requested because they were available. And in spite of that, the author remains friendly with Lucky Coyote. And it's not until later that, like about a year later after this event, that a friend of Lucky's actually messages the author and tells her off. Says that the author is an annoying fangirl who has no chance being Lucky Coyote's friend and needs to go away. So Hoku, kind of confused and taken aback by this, she screen caps the conversation and sends it to Lucky, presumably over Telegram. Lucky reads it, but doesn't respond. This is the back and forth that they had about the fursuit, by the way. But yeah, they went into great detail at the end of this testimony, basically saying that the friendship that they shared with Lucky Coyote gave her hope that she had a lot of enjoyment during her time with Lucky Coyote. And there's a particular piece of, gift art that she received from Lucky, basically showing Lucky teaching Sky how to, fly with wings. And, they felt heartbroken about everything that happened, which is just absolutely sad. So at long last, after reading all of those testimonials, Anonymous Panda, as far as I know, is the last testimonial. Now, this is by no means the end-all be-all of all the testimonials because we have no idea how many people Lucky Coyote engaged with on an intimate basis throughout the years. However, what we can say is that Anonymous Panda's testimony basically corroborates a lot of the earlier testimonies that remark on Lucky Coyote's behavior to other people. But without further ado, let's just go ahead and read this. Also, real quick, there might be more testimonies added in the future if they can be sort of corroborated as having actually occurred and not being a completely, fake made-up story. I'm not sure if that's happened yet. I'm not sure if anybody's been sort of outed as trying to submit a fake story. But some of these have relationships with one another, and it stands to reason that some of the people in these testimonies are proven to be or claim to be having association with another person mentioned. But anyway, let's go ahead and without further ado, get into this. So basically right off the bat, Anonymous Panda mentions how this isn't going to be very long, and I can scroll down here and show that's not very long. But it was about 2008 to 2009 that they actually met Lucky Coyote after they got their first fursuit, and that the author, Lucky, and another friend were pretty close at conventions. They ended up hanging out a lot, talking, and, Anonymous Panda felt like it was a great thing. Now, this lasted for a couple of years, but one odd thing that they felt had to be mentioned was that every time that they saw Lucky Coyote at conventions, Lucky would act just a little bit differently towards her. Some days she'd be friendly and happy, and other days she'd be almost entirely artificial. And she couldn't help but feel that Lucky Coyote would treat her like a, overhyped up fan. Just very dismissively and unfriendly. But it almost seemed like every time that Anonymous Panda saw Lucky Coyote, she would be an entirely different person. So they would share some small talk and passing fancy at conventions, and it really depended largely on Lucky's mood. So there was a point where, towards the later part of their interactions together, that Lucky Coyote mentioned how she enjoyed people watching, and she seemed to remark poorly on everyone around her, and she would be making fun of complete strangers for little more than her own amusement. And the author can't help but wonder, to this day, whether she might have done something or said something that might have upset Lucky Coyote to have caused her to react towards her in the way that she did. And that she closes this out by saying that Lucky Coyote, reading all of these testimonies and comparing her own experiences with everyone else that made a testimony, she can't help but feel that Lucky Coyote just recycles people. And she ends up congratulating everyone that had the bravery and the wherewithal to step forward and offer their own testimonies on their interactions with Lucky Coyote to date. But that concludes all the testimonies. It's entirely possible that more testimonies will appear in the near future, but as of right now, 3/31/2021, these are all the testimonies that I have read through. The order has been changed around a little bit, but for the purposes of this video, apart from Anonymous Bear and Todds testimonies, all the others fall in order. So, let's go ahead and continue with some of the other materials, shall we? So after reviewing all the testimonies, we are offered some condensed TLDR summaries or footnotes that basically touch on the most problematic aspects of some of the testimonies that we've already read. I'm not going to get into these too deeply because we've already covered that in the testimonies. However, I will be touching on the footnotes here because they are pretty much synonymous with the allegations against Lucky Coyote and her problematic behavior to date. So we've already touched on transphobia and racism. How Lucky Coyote used the N-word pretty casually, and the way that it was used was kind of so casual that she probably used it in normal conversation. Hopefully didn't make a habit of it, although the author at the time, having been recipient to hearing that, couldn't help but feel it was. As far as transphobia goes, Lucky Coyote didn't seem to take transphobic people, or trans people very seriously, would very downplay any biological females that had the gender identity of being males. She would just basically downplay that and treat it like it was a fad or a phase. But yeah. Animal abuse and neglect. I definitely believe this to be a thing, given the frequency by which Lucky Coyote acquires animals and then summarily gets rid of them in a relatively short span of time. We've already touched on this with some of the testimonies. Not all the testimonies reflect this, but a couple do shed some light on her interactions with people. You see the mentioning and the announcement of her acquiring, certain animals and unique pets, only for later to express concern or sadness at their passing or having gotten rid of them, or expressing, kind of annoyance or anger at, some of their behavior. But this is largely taken from Lucky Coyote's own forms of social media. In this case, this seems to be a screen cap from Fur Affinity, that furry website where it's a repository for furry artwork. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and skip through that. We'll come back to this later, but I just wanted to go through this right now. We've already seen some of that. Didn't see that before. What a cute group of rabbits. Kali, and I believe that should be Pepsi. I'm not entirely sure. I believe that's Ren. Oh no, that's Uno. Sorry. I don't know why Ren came up. Alright. Cute little birds. Parakeet. Jesus Christ, how many pets does this lady have? Boy, vey, look at these prices. On grooming minors. Definitely am starting to believe this if the testimonies can be believed in their entirety. But at the same time, well, I'm going to get into that when we actually talk about this in full as a synopsis to everything that we've seen, but I just want to go through this so that you're all aware of what kind of material here. We already looked at this before for Lizard's testimony. Zoophilic tendencies, yes. We've already touched up on that too. And they basically showcase your character, doing stuff and posing for the camera. Little paw print on the hips. Supposedly a call sign. All this has been censored, so I'm not too worried about it, but at the same time, you know, it is pornography. Take it from the source. Oh my. Alright, so they also provide a closing statement. A lot of what you saw up above from point A to point B didn't seem all that, like, you know, concerning. But, you know, things are often subtle. They're not too concerning until you actually read between the lines. So maybe you all are seeing something I'm not for some of these. I will say that the problematic behavior that I'm most concerned about is the fact that it always seemed to be biological females that Lucky Coyote was drawn to, and she would basically groom them over the course of their interactions together. But we don't have to go into detail on that right now. We can cover that during our overview video. Alright, footnotes. Yeah, so this Google Doc, a link to it will be provided in the description of this video for you all to just sort of draw your own conclusions from what you read here. I read everything and I tried to provide a synopsis, basically boiling down what the author was saying. Some of them are vague, some of them are very specific, and they even corroborate some of the testimonies from other people. And while the style of writing fluctuates between a little bit formulaic to, unique, there are signs that either this document was collated by a small number of individuals or that some of these testimonies were written by, different people entirely, based on their writing style, based on their use of language, their verbiage, what kind of terms that they would use to just sort of describe everything that happened to them. But yeah. Let us continue on to the overview, shall we? So now that we've had a chance to look over all of the testimonies in their entirety, we can just sort of assess, the key takeaways from this particular list of testimonials, this entire Google Doc. What can we really walk away from all this? Well, one thing I'm going to say right now is that the, demographics of the individuals that actually had contact with Lucky Coyote, with the exception of Todd and a few others, is that for the most part, a lot of these people, I got the impression that a lot of them, in spite of the fact that they didn't share any really identifying details other than a couple of them, is that they were initially biologically female when they got into contact with Lucky Coyote. Or, more accurately, there are occasions where Lucky Coyote would actually reach out to the victims. And they usually, I think the youngest was about 14 to 15 years old, and the rest were, basically between the ages of 14 to 21. That's the overarching, sort of broad range of individuals that we're talking about here. So, over the span of a couple years. Nothing like a decade between them, but, bear in mind, throughout all of this, Lucky Coyote would either be in her late 20s or early 30s. And, when she gained prominence, back in the 2008s onwards, she was definitely a powerhouse name. I mean, a lot of fursuit makers would recognize her as being a top-tier fursuiter or fursuit maker. And a lot of, fans throughout the furry fandom really looked up to her. One thing I will say is that a lot of the people mentioned that they had this particular high when they were with Lucky Coyote, that she was just spontaneous and that her magnanimous personality really showed her in a positive light, that she had a lot of charm and charisma to back her up, and that a lot of these people were younger. They also had aspirations of their own in an artistic sense. They wanted to be fursuit makers themselves. They wanted to be artists. They had a lot of reverence and respect for Lucky Coyote, which put them in a position to be perhaps taken advantage of, influenced unduly, that if Lucky Coyote behaved a certain way, they would respond to try to get back into her good graces, or they would want to behave a certain way to keep a good thing going, which was being close with Lucky Coyote. And Lucky Coyote, for the most part, she seems to have the grooming. I definitely believe is a potential factor in all this, given the ages of the victims and how a lot of them seem to consistently be of a younger variety of audience versus there's not a whole lot of diversity between the number of years that somebody actually had gotten into touch with Lucky Coyote and getting very close with them in a relatively short span of time. Some of her key behaviors was that she would love bomb people. She would basically place them on a pedestal and act like they were the latest and greatest things in sliced bread. And either the friendship would last for a couple years or several years, or it would last for a much shorter span of time, in which case Lucky Coyote, either there was drama that happened between Lucky and the victim, or perhaps, as was the case, some people just, I don't know, they fizzled out, they drifted away. They never really got a certain answer on whether or not they were still friends with Lucky Coyote, or whether Lucky Coyote had reason to sort of cut them out of their lives. And there were several occasions that the victim would try to reach out to Lucky Coyote after the fact and just be like, hey, are we still cool? And Lucky Coyote would get the message but never respond to it. So yeah. And looking at all this, zoophilia, perhaps the weakest allegation to be brought to bear has to be zoophilia, because only a handful of the people that had written testimonies about Lucky Coyote mentioned that Lucky Coyote would share with them, in private, in confidence, the fact that she was fucked by the family dog, which was a German Shepherd, back when she lived with Mom and Pop. And it's kind of surprising. I mean, why? I'm trying to think of the context of why you would bring that up in conversation. That's not typically something that you would just bring up and, share with somebody. Although, I would have to say that a recurrent theme throughout a lot of the conversations with Lucky Coyote is that she was a very sexualized person, that she loved to be flirtatious with people that she, really had a liking for, which was a lot of these fans that would look up to her. And, she would be very sexualized even though the person would be underage at the time, that they shouldn't be talking about adult-related subjects with somebody that's over a decade older than they are. But, yeah, it was, kind of a thing. One particular testimony talked about how, in detail, that she was a zoophile, that she was a practicing zoophile, and Lucky Coyote herself would share the details on how to recognize a zoophile in the fandom, look at the paw prints on the hips, why she drew dog dick so accurately on her characters, and just little concerning things like that sort of culminate, and you have to wonder, could this be credible? Could this be credible? I want to believe that the testimonies are credible, but in all fairness, I will mention, before we continue, that the testimonies are all over the place as far as the quality, the amount of detail that the individual goes through. Only a few people reveal their actual names, usually their Twitter handles, and what they're known as throughout the furry fandom. Most kept themselves anonymous and labeled, a particular animal, like anonymous panda, anonymous fox, or anonymous bear. And some of these testimonies are actually corroborated by other individuals that actually knew the individual that was writing the testimony, as in they had prior contact. In a few cases, they had a falling out, so they were no longer friends, but they had the mutual benefit of having known Lucky Coyote at the same time that they were friends. Also, in all fairness, a lot of these testimonies span over a course of years. Sometimes they mention specific dates. Other people mention, how long it's been. Several years, 9 years, 7 years, 8 years. They mention how long they've known Lucky Coyote and what they've all been through. But, given the length of the document, this was a lot to go through, alright? And I tried to leave no stone unturned. I tried to get to, when I provided you all a breakdown, a TLDR, sort of synopsis that condenses everything that's written. I tried to offer you guys something that was of tangible value, that you can pick up, look at, listen to, and not have to read it all yourself, but if you want to read it all yourself, I encourage you to do so. Link will be in the description, as mentioned before, but yeah. Other allegations, I definitely believe that she has an issue with the procurement and the treatment of small animals. Usually, there was a variety of birds and dogs, and a cat that was involved with all this, and rabbits. And yeah, she basically would have this recurrent behavior of acquiring animals celebrating their acquisition over social media, and then in a relatively short span of time either announcing that they were giving them away, or that they had died under mysterious circumstances, or that she was trying to sell them. And it was like always a question why she would go through the effort of trying to acquire a small animal and then get rid of it. There's also allegations of sexual assault. One testimony goes into very graphic detail of how, Lucky Coyote had essentially put herself on top of her victim, and her victim was shouted at by Lucky Coyote, and they were kind of scared to say no. And Lucky Coyote just kind of goaded them into, sexual experience, and then bragged about it after the fact to all their friends, something that should have been kept in private. And when the victim actually came out and explained, what actually happened, that, hey, I was kind of coerced into this and I had to fake an orgasm to get out of it, she was accused of being a liar, and she was basically cast out of the group over a span of time. So yeah, all of these testimonies should be, I wouldn't say they should be taken at face value, but at the very least, it shows that a lot of people allegedly knew Lucky Coyote over a span of time and had noticed certain quirks about her behavior. She seemed to employ a lot of hot and cold, as in if you had given her no reason for her to be mean or nasty to you, she would treat you well. It'd be hot. It'd be like warmth, like shower you with warmth, affection, compassion. And if you did anything, like you maybe took inspiration from her artistic style when you drew something, or if you took inspiration from her fursuit style when you made fursuits, she would get cold, dismissive, mean, and very nasty towards, her victims. And it got to the point where certain people, certain friends that recognized her behavioral patterns, they would actually give people that were relatively new to Lucky Coyote, like the quote-unquote Lucky Coyote handbook guide on how to deal with Lucky Coyote. Basically, stay in her good graces, give her what she wants, and just try to be, amicable about the whole thing. And this was something that her husband Scuff and, some friends would actually tell newcomers that would initiate contact with Lucky Coyote. Lucky Coyote would often initiate contact with other people, usually sharing her phone number and having reason to contact them. Although one person made the observation that Lucky Coyote seemed to treat the animals in her care much like she did the people, that they were, objects to be used. And Lucky Coyote seemed to be a vindictive, malicious person because she would actually put people into disadvantageous situations for them to, experience whatever chaos was happening in the moment for Lucky Coyote to laugh about after the fact. She showed a lot of weird, almost, I wouldn't say sociopathic per se. It's a bad habit bringing up sociopathic as a terminology here for everybody, but there's something definitely not right with that sort of behavioral pattern, that you love bomb someone, you treat them like they're the greatest and latest thing in your life, and then a short span of time later, you can give absolutely two fucks less than you did 5 minutes ago about them, and just drift apart. But a lot of people seem to go through that experience. Granted, I have to say that a lot of these people were young, impressionable, and were looking up to a mentor figure, which was Lucky Coyote, somebody that they wanted to please, they wanted to pleasure, they wanted to get into their good graces, they wanted to spend time with them, they wanted to enjoy their company. And it stands to reason. I've seen plenty of people like Lucky Coyote, so I have no doubts that might have been a defining trait about her up to this point in time. I don't know now because there's not a whole lot of recent testimonies, in recent years, that basically detail what Lucky Coyote is like now. About the only introduction I got to that was on the 18th February, when she came out on video and basically gave her side of the story, explaining herself and trying to put up some sort of defense against all the allegations that have been put against her to date. It wasn't very convincing though. She put on a very professional front, but it seemed almost cold, dismissive. Not really the whole warm, cuddly, hey, you guys can trust me. But hey, I guess I prefer cold and professional over artificiality with Kira the Wolf, so we can save her good graces for that. But yeah, the testimonies that were listed here that I went over one by one, they are joined by screen caps that I glossed over and showed you all, I reviewed those screen caps as well, and while they are a little bit sketchy, they're not quite as incriminating as you might expect. At least that was my opinion. Like, some of them are. The pets thing, like showing all the pets that she's had, and cross-referencing that with her social media posts announcing the time that she acquired the animal versus the time that the animal either died, was given away, sold. Yeah, that's compelling enough to tell me that she's got a pattern of acquiring small animals and getting rid of them for little to no reason under dubious circumstances after the fact. Something I'll mention is that Shiokami, like I mentioned her before, but Shiokami took it upon herself to try to go above and beyond reviewing this case. She wanted to get to the bottom of, whether or not Lucky Coyote was actually innocent or guilty. And what I will say is that Shiokami gives Lucky Coyote a lot more benefit of the doubt than I did. And she tried to be a lot more objective and impartial in her assessment of Lucky Coyote and her behavior. She didn't take the Google Docs seriously at all and said that basically, anybody can get together and write a bunch of bogus stories about somebody. However, Lucky Coyote and Scuff would actually end up contacting Shiokami and were interested in appearing on the show with, Brony Inspector, Shiokami's friend and associate, to basically give their side of the story. So this happened on the tail end of several weeks of Shiokami sporadically releasing videos about the whole Don't Hug Cacti controversy. And Lucky Coyote and Scuff actually appears on the show. Now, this was obviously a podcast, so you only see artwork of their characters. You don't actually see them, in person or over webcam. It's through a Discord call, I can only assume, but it's important to note that Scuff Coyote, he took a very dominant stance in how to lead the conversation. And I actually watched the entire thing 2 hours long, twice. Granted, it's been a span of time since I watched it, so I will say that my memory might be a little fuzzy. It's a lot to take in, 2 hours. But what I'll just say right now is that Scuff would sort of turn the conversation a certain way, on certain topics, or he would cut in to say something. And it seemed like Lucky Coyote took a very marginal approach to a lot of answering the questions. And certain things she would basically dismiss entirely, I've never had sex with animals, I've never done this, that, and the other. But, certain things, she actually showed her side of the story as far as personal interactions with some of these individuals and what had been going on. And she seemed almost embarrassed about certain stories, like when she went to the film festival and had a bad trip. She did admit to being on LSD, so she didn't really, some of the events that were portrayed, it's like a he said, she said sort of thing. They are referencing the same event, but the memories by the individual, the victim, versus the perpetrator, Lucky Coyote, or alleged perpetrator, I should say, are slightly different from one another. Not quite as consistent as you might expect. And I'm actually curious about, I wish Scuff gave a statement on his own, separate from everybody else, because a lot of the victims seem to like Scuff. They liked him, hanging out with him, one-on-one sometimes, versus with Lucky Coyote. The dynamic would be, he was kind of like the good cop if Lucky Coyote is considered the bad cop when her true colors sort of came out. But that's just speculation on my part. What I will say is that one thing I didn't like about the podcast, and I'll try to put a clip in here, but Brony Inspector, he had, I don't know if he read the testimonials to the same degree that I did, because he basically says, I was reading some of these testimonies, and I gotta say, it's they're talking about a lot of personal shit that was happening in their life, and I'm like, what did Lucky Coyote do to you again? And if you read the testimonies in their entirety, their mentioning of what was going on in their lives establishes their mental state at the time. There was purpose to mentioning that, because it establishes you are, say you had a bad breakup, you're far away from home, from your parents, you have no support structure. You are alone and vulnerable. You have somebody that's fairly well popular and well known throughout the fandom that's willing to help you. And, it basically speaks to the fact that Lucky Coyote, in some cases, would take advantage of people that were isolated from, normal support structures like family and friends to, insulate them from the influences of somebody like Lucky Coyote, if you can believe the testimonies, that is. I keep repeating that because it's important to note that The testimonies are the claims of people that claim to have had close associations with Lucky Coyote, and Lucky Coyote, I have to say, her theory that these were all just fursuit makers and their friends that were trying to knock her out of the business, to knock out a competitor out of the business, is a little bit far-fetched for me, because as far as I know, fursuit makers are up to their eyeballs in commissions. I don't think there's that much demand for, like, more customers. I think they have just as many customers as they need, although during the COVID-19, maybe that's debatable. But anyway, it speaks to their, like, state of mind at the time, you know? You go through a bad breakup and you have somebody that potentially you shouldn't be trusting, but you trust them anyway because they're close, they're available, and they are telling you all the great things that you want to hear. One thing that I forgot to mention before about Lucky Coyote's behavior is that anything shared with her in private would end up becoming public knowledge within her friend groups, because she couldn't keep secrets. She had to reveal what she knew. She would share intimate details with friends, and it would be a shock to anybody that shared anything private or secret with her that she would turn around and reveal it to other people. But yeah, she would offer drugs and alcohol to minors. There were a couple of stories about how she offered alcohol to them, and being offered alcohol by Lucky Coyote. They were usually a minor at that point, so it's kind of questionable and skeevy. Like, I certainly wouldn't encourage, like, underage drug use or alcohol use, but things happen in this world, and I just kind of have to shrug my shoulders and, you know, carry on. But yeah, there were a couple of testimonies that, like, you know, shed light on her business practices. In fact, her response video, I should say, seemed to focus more on her business practices and how, like, you know, how artificial the people that were engaging with her, how they would give her praise online over webmail, and when they were leaving a review on her company, like, as far as the company's performance, they would usually leave negative reviews, you know, that were completely contradicted by their, like, you know, private conversations together. So that is definitely another issue to think about. But all in all, it just seems like, for me, the fact that Lucky Coyote served a cease and desist order, she claims that she tried to talk to Cutins directly, and that the mink firm tried to talk to Cutins directly just to have a conversation, and that Cutins didn't respond, so that's when they opted for the cease and desist order. Whether or not that's true, Cutins certainly didn't mention it, but it's possible. It's also entirely possible that maybe they got the wrong contact details. Maybe they were calling the wrong number. Maybe their, like, methodologies by contacting Cutins, like, you know, was not seen until the cease and desist order came. There's a million different ways it can go down, but yeah. Lucky Coyote revealed a lot of, you know, the other side of the argument. The perception that she gave is that a lot of these people were emotionally fragile, and they basically pestered her to the point that, you know, she absolutely had to cut them off at some point. That's why she did the things that she did, which is entirely possible. I've certainly had annoying friends like that, where there comes a point you just lack the emotional energy to really deal with them, and eventually you just have to insulate yourself, cut them off, and just move on with your own daily life to get what you need to get done, whether it's a job or project or working on things. You don't have an infinite amount of emotional energy, even though you might be an extrovert or you might be doing this, that, and the other. People have a finite bandwidth of how many people they can engage with and have a good time with and really be close to. And, you know, it gets they get burnout, like, if they're exposed to that all the time. So it's entirely possible, just to be completely fair. But most of the fandom has already made its decision on Lucky Coyote's guilt, it seems like, and there have been numerous instances on Twitter, especially ever since the cease and desist order came out, that people have been attacking people that advocate for Don't Hug Cacti, you know, studios. They would attack them for getting fursuits from Don't Hug Cacti. They would, you know, ostracize them harshly for showing any signs of support to Lucky Coyote because of the perception that Lucky Coyote was a manipulator. She was an abuser. She emotionally and, you know, in some cases physically abused people. I say physically for that one sexual assault incident. She would do all of these crazy things, like, in the minds of the furry fandom, that she was absolutely guilty of, and mistreated small animals, was a zoophile herself. I would have to say that the zoophile allegations are flaky at best, because I've seen plenty of furries that weren't zoophiles that had the paw print tattoos on their hips. Just saying that from before. But at the same time, the testimonies, if she shared that in confidence with somebody, she did a good job covering her tracks, because, some people in the testimonies would reference the fact that Lucky Coyote would seldom say anything of import over anything like Telegram that could be screen capped or forwarded. So she had some awareness of her activities online, it seemed like. But yeah, Lucky Coyote, I guess the one song that comes to mind in describing her is Girls Just Want to Have Fun. She didn't think too deeply into her actions at the time. She just hooked up with whoever seemed cool and interesting. And I've gone through this as well. Like, people have sort of used me. They get as close as they can to you and learn everything they can about you, and then, they're done. They cut you off, you drift apart, or they cut you off, or, they just stop spending time with you because you're no longer interesting to them. That's how I see Lucky Coyote, like, reading all this. And plenty of people would agree with me, at least the people that wrote this document, I would say. But a lot of furries out there would also agree with me, because if you've seen the reactions on Twitter, it's just crazy. But in all fairness, I think the strongest indicator that Lucky Coyote might be guilty was that her side video, just basically explaining herself, didn't offer a great deal of information to address the grievances that the furry fandom was bringing up to her, as well as the fact that the cease and desist order to remove everything that was problematic for her image to just be taken down, instead of having a detailed conversation or some sort of reconciliation with her and the damaged parties, tells me that maybe she has something to hide. And this was sort of the Streisand effect, because now, instead of just the handful of furries that would see the Google document that was floating around, as well as whatever the communications and tweets have been going on, now they're seeing the entire thing being circulating around Twitter and making its rounds on social media, and they're being pulled into it, kind of like I was. And it's important to note that, because I guess they were doing it because it was hurting business, like that Google Docs was hurting business, that the communications by Cutins and her friends were also hurting business. But at the same time, you don't fucking silence people because they say something you don't like. If somebody makes a comment on my YouTube channel that I don't like, usually I'll leave it up, but certain things like threatening or certain other things I'll probably delete, because I'm just I don't need that shit here. Fuck off. But for the most part, I'm anti-censorship. I don't like to see people get censored. I don't like the censorship of others. But it should be due criticism instead of just spam or bullshit like that, actual, tangible conversation of value. I'm not going to get into the whole, can you yell fire in a crowded theater, alright? That shouldn't, apply here. The implications for that are a little bit different than just expressing an opinion that you have. But these testimonies don't read like opinions, They read like people that genuinely believe that they were wronged by Lucky Coyote, and they were fearful to say anything because they knew that Lucky Coyote had a lot of clout in the fandom for being the popular fursuit maker that she was, and that they felt that if they had spoken out, that their reputations would be shot, that they would be ostracized and canceled by people throughout the furry fandom just for daring to speak out against Lucky Coyote or elicit her ire. And I can certainly get that, There's plenty of people out there that are intimidated by somebody that's a big name, alright? And especially if they're young, which some of these people were at the time of their meeting Lucky Coyote. If these are true, if all of these can be believed in their entirety, all I can really say is shame on you, Lucky Coyote, for taking advantage of the young people of the furry fandom. Because, and it's been pointed out, plenty of people in the furry fandom are of the younger variety. Alright, I'm not going to deny that, but maybe that is a basis for why pedophilia is such a problem, because perhaps this is just an anecdotal observation on my part, but it feels like every other week I would hear or see a story in the news or online, and there was even some stories where there were people masquerading as being furries that were found out to be pedophiles that were, using the whole furry fandom mantra to get sexual pleasure out of kids, and that was just absolutely sick. It might be the subject for a video where I talk about zoophilia and pedophilia and how it's become a almost pandemic problem in the furry fandom, at least to the degree that, it's happening so frequently that I'm wondering, if, the furry fandom really generally does have a zoophilia or pedophilia problem. But yeah, going back to Lucky Coyote, grooming of minors, that just seemed like an aspect of what she would do online when she engaged with her fans. There was a lot of talk of, her behavior and just how, I guess the good half was feeling close, trusted, very warm and compassionate individual. But Lucky Coyote is a woman of many masks, as it would turn out, because one recurrent theme about her is that sometimes she would act a little bit weird. As in, she wouldn't act in a tangible, sensible manner. She would put on an air of artificiality when engaging with people that she didn't particularly trust or like. And, as far as her business practices go, she made an offer to somebody that she was trying to impress, I suppose, and they were supposed to be working on a fursuit for, somebody that was no longer boyfriend with the individual that was getting close to Lucky Coyote. And, she said, hey, I can cancel his fursuit and refund his money. I can do that as a fursuit maker. I can make up a cockamamie bullshit story right now. You want me to do that? I can deny him having a fursuit made by me. And she would mention how she, she would purposely make shoddy fursuits for people that she didn't particularly like. There were a couple of testimonies that corroborated the story that she didn't seem to think highly of her fans. In fact, on one occasion when she was supposed to go to a fursuit meet that was made specifically for her, to celebrate her, and was comprised of fursuits made by her company, she chanted under her breath that she didn't want to go, and she absolutely made every excuse under the sun, why she shouldn't go. And she just could not be bothered to go out there and see her fans, and she had to be encouraged. This was Anonymous Frog's testimony, I believe. She had to be encouraged by Anonymous Frog to, go out there and just get it done. And Anonymous Frog couldn't help but feel that, Lucky Coyote was gritting her teeth in blind rage and fury under that fursuit head. But yeah, goes without reason. Also, Lucky Coyote might be casually racist. At least she's used the N-word a couple times in conversation with somebody when she shouldn't have. It made the person that heard that very uncomfortable to hear that. And it was so casually delivered that it led the author of that particular testimony to believe that Lucky Coyote was probably using the N-word, casually in conversation, which is certainly problematic. I mean, the perceptions certainly aren't good for the furry fandom. She's white, she's blonde. I don't care about race, alright? I think that we all need to learn to live together and, look beyond race and accept each other for who we are and judge each other more about our personality traits and whether we're, good, problematic, maybe need some work, whatever. But yeah, the other thing is that she was mildly transphobic, that she would be sort of denigrating LGBTQ people. She would be dismissive of LGBTQ couples. She would routinely try to portray the authors of the testimonies that identified as being male as female or feminine. They would draw gift art of them being female or feminine, and they would often downplay their expressions of wanting to be trans for having a phase. It's just a phase, honey. You're gonna outgrow it. All little girls want to be little boys at one point in their life, but they grow out of it. Her words in one of her testimonies. One of the testimonies about her, I should say. So, that's all important to bear in mind when sort of looking at Lucky Coyote and trying to assess whether or not that she is to be believed or trusted or, accepted as being, honest in when she came out in that video. When she stated, hey, this is my story. This is, my side of the story. And when she came out on the podcast. What I will say about the podcast is that the podcast was not well received. It had about a 50 to 50% ratio of likes to dislikes. And the issue that a lot of people had with Shiokami, prominent YouTuber that I mentioned before, is that Shiokami took it upon herself to ask the questions that the furry fandom wanted to ask of Lucky Coyote when she engaged with her. And the problem with that is that the furry fandom felt like they were cut out of the equation. That was just like Shiokami putting on the kid gloves and having Lucky Coyote on the show, and Shiokami not asking legitimate questions or being too accepting of the questions or answers, I should say, to the questions that she asked in reference to problematic things, and that she was basically downplaying the plights of the victims throughout the furry fandom. Entirely possible. Shiokami, she made a response podcast talking about it after the fact, and she got very upset herself and how petty and vain that she saw the fandom to be, and she just downplayed it as her being canceled. Now, I can certainly agree with Shiokami trying to give Lucky Coyote the benefit of the doubt, because it appears that Shiokami is the one person to date that has been able to do so. Alright? And I don't think she should be punished for it. I think she was more or less professional in her dealings up to the point of her response podcast, in which case she said, I'm going to say whatever the fuck I want to say at this point. And I get that, I've certainly been to that point with some people, but it's not a good look. And hey, whatever. I certainly don't think of Shiokami any less, but I recognize that there are people throughout the furry fandom that did not appreciate the way that she handled the situation in its entirety. And as far as the real information that we could glean from Lucky Coyote, Scuff kind of stole the show with that whole regard. She talked some, she would give her side of the story, but she basically painted a lot of these people as people that knew each other, people that were friends with each other, and people that she had cut off for good reason and absolutely could not deal with. For instance, they're referencing how conversations go you had that friend that would ping you sometimes and be like, hey, is everything okay? I didn't say anything to make you angry or anything like that, did I? Oh, I'm sorry if I did. She would portray a lot of the people that had written testimonies about her in that light. Like that annoying friend that's overly cautious on how they're engaging with you. That's not quite how this reads, but granted, to give credit where credit is due, a lot of these testimonies are either years out of date by the time that the author was no longer friends with Lucky Coyote, or were several years old. As in, they knew Lucky Coyote for a long time, and only in recent years did they sort of cut off. So there was sort of a breakdown of that. People were more or less transparent about whether or not they had actually known Lucky Coyote personally or not, but yeah. It was revealed during the podcast that Lucky Coyote, in reference to all those rabbits that she kind of let loose in the backyard to be eaten by local wildlife, she was running an illegal, bunny farm, and, basically she gave up on the whole endeavor, viciously killed a rabbit, if one testimony can be believed, with her bare hands to, ended suffering from bloat. And, she admits that it was illegally run, that she wasn't supposed to do it, she didn't know what she was doing. But in reference to the macaw, the parrot, and a couple other things, she mentioned that she mentioned a bullshit story about how she was moving to an apartment, and that turned out not to be true because she ended up staying at the same damn place that everyone else saw. People would recognize that she had not moved like she claimed she was going to. And Lucky Coyote's response to that was that she and Scuff were going through a hard time. Marital issues. Certainly not outside the suspension of disbelief. I could certainly recognize that somebody had been with her and for several years might have some marital issues to sort of work through. But what I will say is that it just seems a little bit too convenient that the macaw is gotten rid of, but she doesn't leave. She doesn't actually go to the apartment. The excuse was that the apartment wouldn't allow exotic animals like a large bird like that. And, a lot of furries were quick to point that out. There's so much more I can go here, but, this video is already incredibly long. And if you've watched up to this point, I greatly appreciate it. But I would just like to say that, the testimonies, reading through those was, long, even though I did TLDR footnote versions. TLDR for all this is that Lucky Coyote appears to be guilty of some of the allegations that have been brought to bear. At the very least, the potential grooming of minors and the emotional, the emotional abuse that she would subject people to, and the drama that she would springboard onto those around her for her own enjoyment. I can definitely believe that as being a consistent pattern that's been referenced in a lot of these documents. And I've met people like that, and for Lucky Coyote, that's not beyond the suspension of disbelief in reference to her. We don't have hard proof of that, though. If a lot of these people would give testimonies through video, chat, they could be cross-referenced by people throughout the furry fandom to assess whether their story matches somebody else's that's supposed to corroborate their story. We can get a lot more accuracy out of this, but as it stands, I'm taking it under faith in the victims. And I'm not saying that you should just automatically believe victims, period, but it certainly sucks if this is the case, but perhaps this wasn't the best way to go about it. But granted, they want to, in their words, they want to warn the furry fandom and the world entirely about Lucky Coyote and her, MO. Zoophilia, I'd have to say I'm on the fence about 50-50. It's certainly possible that she shared some intimate details to elicit trust between the people that she was trying to get close to. But at the same time, there's not a lot of hard evidence that really pins it down, apart from the circumstantial evidence on why dog dick on her characters is so realistic looking, which isn't really unique to her. I mean, a lot of people throughout the furry fandom that aren't zoophiles do that, but the paw prints on her hips are not enough of a call sign for zoophiles, because while it is suspicious, plenty of other furries that have no knowledge of zoophilia have done that. So, yeah, it would have to be the flakiest allegation of the bunch. But the abuse of animals, small animals in her care, including dogs, we've already covered that before. Definitely, I believe she's guilty of that. And the sexual assault story, very, very bad look for her, if that's the case. And the sharing of drugs and alcohol with minors, very problematic. Some of the people inside of these testimonies actually will admit to the fact that they drank underage, but sometimes some things like the film festival thing was an embarrassing memory for Lucky Coyote to bear. So I can see why she would want this Google Doc to be taken down, but at the same time, it was probably in poor taste to have done so, especially through the mink firm of all firms, because these are claims made by people that claim to have had association with Lucky Coyote. I feel like she's lying about it, that the cease and desist motion was just to cover this under the rug and to, dodge any responsibility for anything. But if this ever picks up, she's going to have to answer some hard questions to the rest of the furry fandom, which is going to make for a lot of awkward moments. But, yeah. Listen, I think I've talked about the subject long enough here. I wanted to provide you guys a deeper analysis of everything that's at stake here. There's a lot more evidence out there in the form of social media posts, although Lucky Coyote has shown that she has deleted some Telegram chats, so some avenues of contact are no longer accessible, which shows me that she has something to hide. But again, people do things for various reasons. I'm just going to go ahead and say that unless anything develops from here, Shiokami already ran through her podcast. She made some videos about all of this. I made a video about all this. And, where it goes from here, honestly, Lucky Coyote is not going to be seeking legal action against Cutins because they can't afford it, number one. Number two, they tried to improve their PR, it seems, through a live stream podcast through Shiokami. Shiokami was nice enough to have them on the show, and Brony Inspector was nice enough to participate in talking about it. I can't help but feel that throughout the whole podcast, Brony Inspector wasn't very professional in the way they handle this. And I know you try to breathe humor into certain things, but it seemed in poor taste, in some instances, because Shiokami didn't seem to give the victims here any credibility. She dismissed a lot of the allegations as just bullshit. Perhaps it's very well may be. I hope not. I want to believe, but I just want to give, in all fairness, just bearing everything that we know now in mind. like anybody can get together and write some documentation about somebody and post it online and say that that's the absolute truth. But as with all things, there's always two sides to a given story, and it's important to just bear that in mind and accept it, like, you know, in all these cases, and to use your best judgment when you might have some suspicions on the veracity of certain claims. Anyway, like I said before, I think I've talked about this to great length, and I am ready for bed. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this short right here. Did I say short? I meant long. So, listen, I hope you all enjoyed the video, guys. Until next time, take care and peace. I hope you all have a better one.